Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Edward slowly drove out of the office parking lot and headed towards the center. The businessman's car maneuvered confidently between the rows of cars, the owners of which in about 10 or 20 minutes would quite expectedly hit rush hour. Tuning the radio to his favorite wave, Edward Reynolds wondered how his son Voland was doing. Is Stacy doing okay? It's tough. 7 years in the same wheelchair. Why should the kid have to go through such a ordeal? Tears glistened in the corners of the businessman's eyes. A recent conversation with Justin, the pediatric orthopedist, came to mind. What can I say, Edward? I examined Voland, and I'll tell you this. I found no abnormalities. You see, I've told you before and I'll tell you again, your son's ailment is not physical, but rather psychological. So Voland has no injuries or trauma. Will he be able to walk as he used to? Edward asked hopefully. The doctor furrowed his brow, trying to find the right words for the businessman. Depends on what you mean by the word injury. Of course, as such in terms of the physical, your son doesn't have one. But the psyche is a special thing, little studied. As they say, nothing is certain. No, don't be frightened, of course. Your son will overcome the disease and get back on his feet, but it's very, very early to talk about any specific time frame. Edward sighed sadly. Justin had given him hope, and then he'd taken it away. Now, as he thought back to the conversation with the doctor, Edward could barely contain the despair that was gripping him. Voland's mother had died when he was 2 years old. The boy barely remembered her and had only seen her in photographs. 8 months ago, his stepmother appeared in his life. Edward lived alone for about 5 years, devoting himself completely to his son. But when that terrible robbery happened and Voland stopped walking, he realized that they couldn't go anywhere without a woman's hand. The only problem for Edward was choosing medical personnel for his son, simply put, a nurse. Voland had the temperament of his late grandfather, and it was very difficult to please him. All Edward could hear was, "Dad, don't take offense, but Vicky's no good for me. She won't read books, and she sits on her phone all day. She's even worse than the last auntie, but she plays with me. It's true, she does it by force. But I can feel her eyes are lifeless. Like she's a robot, like something out of a space movie." Edward's heart clenched in pity. What could be easier than finding a caregiver for a little boy? But in reality, it was a lottery of one way or the other. Penelope also tried, but all to no avail. And a new nurse is urgently needed. But where to find her? All accustomed to that, the nurse takes care of lying sick. And here's a boy who can't walk, but he's got a lot of energy. That's where the difficulties arise. The businessman thought on his way home and decided to stop at the store. Edward pulled into the parking lot in front of the supermarket. He knew that Stacy didn't like going to grocery stores, so he'd taken on that responsibility recently. Business partner Jonathan only chuckled when he found Eddie's fiancée. First time I've ever seen a man think about what to make for dinner. What's your job? To provide for your family. To have something to buy bread with, preferably with butter. The rest is up to her. Edward blushed at such remarks and tried to turn the conversation to another direction as quickly as possible. For him, growing up in the countryside, going to the store was no big deal. The most important thing was to have something to go to the store with, and the rest was nothing. When he entered the supermarket, Edward picked up his basket and headed for the freshly baked goods section. A Voland loved sweets, and he tried to spoil him from time to time. Fresh cinnamon buns, pies with cherries, pears, jam, and more. His eyes widened. Suddenly, a strange sound caught Edward's attention. It was coming from the neighboring convenience store. Help somebody. There's a man sick in here. Call an ambulance, please. Edward flinched and reached for his pocket, forgetting that he'd left his smartphone in the car. Hey, for fuck's sake, okay? Gotta see what's what. Maybe some other help is needed. When the businessman walked into the neighboring department, a sad picture unfolded before his eyes. An elderly man, a pensioner, lay on his back with no outward signs of life. Nearby, a basket with a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a couple of packs of breadcrumbs, which had toppled over during the fall, was lying orphaned. The people surrounding the man stood around, unsure of what to do next. Maybe he's just drunk. Put forward one of the eyewitnesses a completely ridiculous hypothesis. What are you, man? Jess is intelligent, and clutched at his heart. I saw him standing about 5 meters away. Some woman objected. Suddenly, someone pulled Edward aside and squeezed his way to the center of the circle of people that had formed. Disperse, please. Allow me, came a pleasant female voice. The businessman shifted his gaze to the stranger who had volunteered to help, and literally froze on the spot with amazement. It was a real tramp. No, not dirty, of course, and no odor of alcohol or cigarettes. But the clothes and shoes left a lot to be desired, in an old, worn-out raincoat. But the main thing was not even in this, but in the fact that kneeling down, this stranger about 30 years old began to do Grandpa indirect heart massage. Everyone gasped in surprise, as if they wanted to do the same thing before, but just did not have time. And that's when the unwitting spectators of the unfolding drama went and began to fuss around, trying to help. Someone dialed the number of the ambulance. Someone gave advice, valuable and not so valuable. However, the woman did everything as it should be done. And the confirmation of this was a quiet wheeze from the chest of a man lying on the floor. Thank God, alive, ran through the crowd. Just as the ambulance arrived, the paramedics rushing to the scene entered the supermarket lobby. The tramp disappeared into the crowd and was about to disappear when Edward touched her arm. Wait, don't go. Would you like a ride? The woman looked ironically at the respectable businessman standing in front of her. You will. And why? I don't think you want to ask me out. Then what's this all about? I'm not too far away. So thank you, but I'll pass. Edward blushed embarrassedly, but he didn't back down. I'm sorry, I may have misspoken. You see, or rather my son, needs help. She shook her head. And how can I help you? I'm not a medical professional. Not right now, anyway. And children require special treatment. No, I'm not the right person for you. Edward turned dark. The flame of hope was slowly fading, sinking more and more into the abyss of sadness. Suddenly, as if remembering something, the businessman reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. Here, look. This is my son, Volan. He is 7. He can't walk, though he's not disabled, but he really needs help. Maybe you'll do it? The stranger took the picture carefully, and her hands trembled. My God, he's so small. Why did he have to go through all this? Edward felt her hesitate as she looked at him. In truth, he didn't know the real reason for his choice. Inviting a man from the street into the house was reckless, to say the least. On the other hand, the way the stranger had rescued the elderly customer deserved respect, for not everyone had such specific skills. My name's Edward. Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you and I'll pay you generously for my services. At least give it a try. If it doesn't work out, I won't consider you an enemy or a bad person. You can live in our house. There's plenty of room for everyone. Don't even doubt it, Edward went on the offensive again. I'm Penelope Smith. He looked at her hopefully. So you agree? Did I get it right? Penelope smiled almost for the first time since their acquaintance. I agree. Where can I go from you? Only in advance. I do not promise anything. After all, I've hardly ever worked with children. But before, in a previous life. Edward nodded, and then invited her to the car. He didn't feel like shopping today, especially after what had happened at the store. On the way to her employer's house, Penelope behaved modestly, remaining silent, glancing out the window occasionally. Edward didn't ask any questions, realizing that his new acquaintance needed time to settle in. As she sat in the front seat of the huge SUV, Penelope literally disappeared into it, becoming almost invisible and very small. Edward winked at her and increased the speed. The businessman drove the car confidently, expertly. Penelope relaxed and drifted off to sleep. Fortunately, the drive was not far, and soon Edward's house was in sight, or rather, his late wife Vivie's. To be precise, and Edward valued precision above all else. Here we are. Oh, I forgot to tell you, for the sake of convenience, I'd like to use the first name, without any patronymics, and so on. I'm a simple man from the village. It would be easier for me, Edward said, stopping the car in front of the house. Penelope nodded embarrassedly and opened the door, leaving the cozy interior of the SUV. It was early fall, and a sharp gust of wind made her body shiver. As the sun set, it was getting quite chilly. The guests' clothes were, to put it mildly, inappropriate for the season. Realizing this, Edward headed for the door to go inside, but Stacy was already there to greet them. What are you doing out so late? I called you several times, but I couldn't get through. Oh, we have company. Oh, I see. Stacy glanced at Edward, but he shrugged to ease the awkwardness. The businessman asked, "Where's my favorite son? Why isn't he meeting his daddy?" Stacy pursed her lips in frustration. And Volan was in a bad mood again. He threw a construction set out the window. Can you believe it? That's not true. It wasn't like that at all. My son's voice came from the next room. What was it like then? Tell Daddy. Don't be shy, Stacy snapped at him. I didn't throw it away. I shared it with my friends. Their parents didn't have the money to buy one. So I threw it down from the window to the boys in a box. Let them play. I'm not sorry. Volan objected and left the room in his wheelchair. He shared. How could he? You're such a smart ass. Have you thought how much money that purchase cost your father? When you start earning your own money, then you'll be able to manage your things. But you don't work, Aunt Stacy. But you do manage Daddy's money, Volan immediately said, which took his stepmother by surprise. Penelope coughed embarrassedly, making it clear that she was not very pleased to hear the family squabble. Come on, I'll show you where your room is. Edward caught up and pointed down the long hallway. Volan gave Penelope a wary look and thought, well, another nurse. I bet she's going to be on the phone 24 hours a day. Stacy looked at her stepson with hatred, though in truth he had done nothing wrong. In spite of his young age, Volan had already developed his own opinions that were at odds with Stacy's, and this often caused friction between the two of them. Only Edward could stop it, Stacy had prepared all sorts of goodies and delicacies for dinner. Stacy was on top of her game, as always. "What's with all this? We're not going to eat it anyway," Edward asked with a smile. "I got carried away. It just came out of the blue. You know I like to cook," she said with pride in her voice. She gave Voland an angry glance. The boy obediently lowered his eyes and began picking at his salad with his fork. In fact, he knew very well that Stacy had not cooked anything and had purchased all this culinary splendor at a restaurant, ordering a dozen dishes for home delivery. Voland remembered well the time his stepmother had almost burned down the kitchen when she had tried to make him an omelet. Stacy had ended up handing him a package of instant noodles and recommending that he pour hot water over them. Of course, Edward didn't know about all of this, as his fiancée was very cunning and forward-thinking. Penelope sat silently at dinner, mentally berating herself for accepting the businessman's offer. Stacy was looking at her, not lurking, like a shopper selecting things at the market. "What, you don't use that knife? Can't you eat with a fork?" she tried to tease her guest. "No, it's just more comfortable for me," Penelope said modestly. Stacy grinned, not noticing Voland's judgmental gaze. Frankly speaking, the boy did not like the behavior of his stepmother, who from the first minutes of communication began to build herself a queen. She herself is no better than Penelope thought. At least the guest keeps calm, does not interfere with questions, like the past aunts who worked in the house. After dinner, everyone went to their rooms. Penelope had one now, although at first she still preferred to go to Goldmort. "Hello, I'm Penelope. Perhaps you already know, but I'm your new nurse. I will now sit with you." The boy looked at her in disbelief. Just like that. And the other aunts immediately tried to cure me, forced gymnastics, called me lazy. I do not want to help myself. Penelope sadly shook her head. "No, why would I try to cure you if you do not want it? I'm right. It is easier for you, more accustomed." Voland's indignation took his breath away. "What are you talking about? I really want to, but I can't walk." "I believe you. I believe you. But if you don't want to heal yourself, no one can help you get out of that wheelchair, not even me. And you know everything. That's why you're so smart. You're just a nurse. Aren't you?" Voland stretched out uncertainly. But Penelope did not answer the question. She had gotten the effect of her words, so she could go to bed with a clear conscience. Edward caught up with her at the door to her room, holding a large package. "Here, take it. It's clothes all new. They're my late wife Vivie's. She never even wore it. I never got around to throwing it away. Don't worry, it's only temporary. You seem to be the same size as her. I knew it right away. Just please don't tell Stacy, or she'll be offended." Penelope was embarrassed. Edward suddenly appeared to her in a completely different light. It was as if he'd been standing in total darkness, and the people around him could only guess at his appearance. "Thank you very much. I'll wear them carefully," Penelope murmured softly, taking the bag. Edward went to his office to work on the month's reports. He'd been having a lot of trouble lately. Although, in the businessman's opinion, it was a sin to complain. Sitting down at his desk, he looked at Voland's picture in a flowery frame and thought about the times when his son had not had such health problems as he had now. And all this was the result of the trauma he had suffered. Not physical, but psychological. Edward blamed himself for what had happened. He'd been advised to equip the house with all sorts of sensors and surveillance cameras, hire a couple or 3 guards, finally get a wolfhound with the voice that would make passers-by shake. But no, he relied on his good reputation in business circles. A high-profile robbery has put everything in its place and subsequently led to irreparable consequences. No, Volan, none of the raiders did not offend. But the shock experienced by the boy during the robbery was so strong that his legs failed. Actually, the robbery itself was without casualties. Masked robbers knew perfectly well the location of rooms in the house and the owner's daily routine, so they quickly found the safes in Edward's study. What happened next was a matter of technique: the break-in, the shouts of joy, and the theft of a large sum of money. Little Wolin stood in the corner and watched in horror as the black-masked men filled a bag with valuables and money. And one of the raiders turned and jokingly threatened the boy with his finger. Wolin pressed his back into the wall and covered his eyes with his palms. The bound maid could do nothing to help and watched idly as her master was robbed. After surviving the raid, she quit the next day, leaving Edward to face his problems alone. Wolin withdrew into himself, lying on his bed for days at a time. The shock he had suffered caused him to develop partial paralysis of his lower limbs. At first, Edward thought that his son's ailment would pass rather quickly. Everyone has unpleasant memories in their lives, and it's okay they walk. What if the businessman only knew how wrong he was? It is not surprising when there are so many counselors around, each of whom is so eager to make his own contribution. Don't worry, he'll be fine. The main thing is that the bones are intact, and everything else is not so important. The main thing for a boy is to have the right physique, to be tall and strong. And your Volan will be just like that. You'll see, you mark my word, Jonathan said. Edward nodded in agreement, trying to find the strength to believe what was causing him the greatest fear. Edward was used to being treated with condescension in business circles. It was as if the gods had come down from Olympus to bless a mere mortal. They say that he has made his way into the elite. Well done. It was about time he showed zeal. Edward knew that many envied him. A rich widower who got $1 million after his wife died in his will. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and Edward had taken it. He grabbed it by the tail, much to the dismay of the others. Virtually no one doubted that it was a marriage of convenience. What else could it be? When you married the daughter of Jacob's richest man. But Edward himself was not a wealthy man. He married Vivie for love alone. And so that no one would think the guy had fallen for his rich bride's assets, he'd even agreed to sign a prenup. That's the right thing to do. That's the way it's done in our circle. No offense. No, but if the marriage is equal, it's different, you know. Everything is equal. You're not a Rothschild, Jacob said. Edward didn't take offense, he understood, and he didn't expect any different treatment. To everyone, he was just another capital hunter for his rich bride. A puppet in the hands of his father-in-law, who played his son-in-law like an experienced puppeteer. No one could even think that Edward cared about Vivie, not her dowry in a foreign bank, cars, luxury homes, and all the other tinsel that the rich of all ranks and colors so often bragged about. Unfortunately, in marriage they lived only 2 years, although before that they met for 3. And all because the father of the bride deliberately delayed the wedding, expecting that the young parted, and the problem will solve itself. What do I need this poor man for? Whose son is he? The tractor driver's son. His mother is unemployed. What kind of status is that? A housewife. What can she do? Tip the cow's tails, Jacob said in a conversation with his wife, who was Vivie's stepmother. Trixie looked at her husband ironically. She didn't want to judge Edward, nor did she want to get into an argument with him, so she preferred to stay neutral. It was better for herself and the people around her. At the time of the wedding, Edward was working as a management trainee in Jacob's office. He wasn't exactly a star in the sky. How could he? When he'd graduated from university only 6 months ago, and by correspondence since he'd been working as a longshoreman to keep from starving in a city so foreign and hostile to him. No one could have guessed that it wouldn't be long before Edward would be the first violinist in the company. "Oh, son, you seem to be making a big mistake. They'll ruin you, the rich people. Nothing is sacred to them. I can see the way they look at you. You're just a servant to them," Edward's mother said bitterly. But the boy did not give up and accepted all the trials with the proper humility, signed a marriage contract, according to which in case of divorce he received nothing. But Edward did not despair. He sincerely loved his wife, and when she gave him Voland, he began to love even more. The birth of his grandson melted the ice in Jacob's heart. His heartfelt conversations with his son-in-law were more and more often accompanied by warm notes. It was still a long way from complete harmony, but Edward didn't want it. Then Jacob's family was haunted by an evil fate. First, Jacob, the head of the company, fell gravely ill. Neither money, nor doctors, nor elite private clinics helped. Many said at the time that this was payback for the years of frenzied accumulation of initial capital, raider takeovers, not so legal schemes. And now the unshakable colossus had fallen, approaching ordinary mortals at arm's length. Deep down, Edward sympathized with his father-in-law and held no grudge. What was there to be angry about when he was so human and could never be changed? Jacob was fading before his eyes. There was nothing the family could do. No folk healer, no fortune tellers, no expensive drugs from abroad helped. Trixie's wife stayed with him every step of the way, trying to ease his condition, but it was all in vain. Jacob was gone. 3 days before his 50th birthday, standing at his father-in-law's fresh grave. Edward didn't know that it would only be a year before the same fate would befall his wife. Her life had been cut short by bilateral pneumonia. It was freezing cold when she went skiing with her friends. Vivie always watched her figure and liked to give her body physical activity. That fateful day, Edward tried to dissuade her. Maybe another time would be better, Vivie. Really such a drastic change. Yesterday it was 0, and today it's almost -20. But his wife immediately reassured him. "Don't worry, Edward, everything will be fine. It's not the first time I've done this. We have to seize the moment or summer will come." "And then what?" "You know you have to act while you can." "Well, you know best, of course. Just girls, be careful." Vivie hugged her husband lovingly. "I promise Penelope and I won't be long. We'll do a couple laps and then back." If only Edward had known where his wife's innocent amusement would lead. He would never have let her leave the house. That fateful morning, the three of them drove out of town in Vivie's car. The weather was clear and frosty, and there was no sign of trouble. But as soon as the car hit the bridge, the worst happened. Vivie had been distracted for a split second while answering a friend's question, which made her too late to notice the sieve crossing into the oncoming traffic lane. In an attempt to avoid the collision, Penelope swerved the steering wheel to the left and rammed into the bridge supports. The car plummeted into the ice-covered river. The impact was so strong that the mangled body of the car broke through the ice and sank into the water about halfway. From afar, the car looked like a float that had lost its integrity and was filling with water. It was slowly going down. Stacy and Vivie started screaming loudly, smashing their palms against the windows. No one wanted to die at that age. Vivie was the first to come to her senses, and unlike her friends, began to squeeze out the windshield because it had a huge crack in it. When she succeeded, there was icy water under her feet. Looking at her friends, Vivie commanded, "Come on, what's the holdup? Hurry up before the car drowns." "Yeah, sure," now Stacy whispered, shivering from the cold, and began to climb to the saving edge of the ice. Vivie followed. Vivie was the last to leave the sinking car, like a shipwrecked captain. Unfortunately, at that moment her clothes were soaked through and her body was already pierced by coal needles. Although the ambulance arrived relatively quickly, Vivie suffered severe frostbite, which later gave complications to her lungs. The doctors did everything they could, but medicine was powerless in such cases. With a high fever, Vivie was thrashing around in delirium and begged for a notary to be brought to her. "Honey, you don't have to. Why are you thinking about it? You're going to get better," Edward begged her. He sincerely believed this, because he rightly believed that money could do anything in a certain situation. God, but it's not cancer. Aren't there any more effective drugs? Edward asked the head of the department, but he just shook his head. Vivie could feel herself fading away, and with each breath the life was slowly leaving her disease-ridden body. "Sweet Edward, I'm so sorry about this. Don't worry, I took care of everything. You and Volan won't need anything," Vivie wheezed, gathering the rest of her strength. "Oh, come on, what are you talking about? You're going to be fine, do you hear me? I'll raise everyone's ears. We'll find a way out," Edward whispered without noticing the tears on his cheeks. But somewhere upstairs in heaven, a decision had already been made. Kneeling in front of his wife's bed, the young widower covered his face with his hands and sobbed. But why should he have all these cursed riches when his beloved is gone and his heart is torn with pain? At the sight of this sad picture, the nurses turned pale and hurriedly passed by, and an elderly nurse even crossed herself as she came closer. "You cry, dear man. Some of the pain will come out with your tears, but don't give up. Live in such a way that your spouse will be proud of you. She's up there in heaven, seeing everything." Edward looked longingly at the nurse. "Thank you, but you don't need to comfort me. It still hurts a lot." She touched his arm sympathetically. "It hurts, honey. Do you have children?" "I do." "Then live for them. Children are our future. They are called the flowers of life for a reason. Only flowers bloom for one season, but babies, if you take care of them, are happy for a long time." To Edward's amazement, the elderly nurse's words had a favorable effect on him. There was something in them that made him pull himself together and think of his son, who was still so young that he didn't understand anything. The funeral and all the subsequent mourning took place like a dream for Edward. At the cemetery, standing by the fresh grave, the young widower realized that the rich cried too, but in their own way. But is he rich? It's not all his. The firm company shares elite real estate. And who is he? So the son of a tractor driver from the village, who decided to try his luck in the big city. But his happiness was short-lived, and the price for it had to pay the highest, one that makes your head spin and your heart ache. Maybe it was all just a dream. Edward had to pinch his shoulder and everything would be back to normal. The village, the birds singing in the morning, and the smell of freshly cut grass. Water from the well, you drink it like nectar, but the cold makes your teeth chatter. But there was no smell of sleep here. All this was a harsh reality to the point of impossibility. At first, no one saw Edward as the heir to a vast empire. They expected him to make a rash move and the whole thing would collapse like a house of cards. And even if it did, they would help it fall. Sooner or later there would be someone to push him, as they say. But Edward not only held on, but also managed to prove that he was worthy of more than the representatives of the business elite gave him. The widower had to go through a lot before his name and surname became indicators of wealth and success. And while everything was going relatively well in business, in his family, on the contrary, problem after problem followed him like an avalanche. I can handle it as long as Stacy is right for Woland. The meeting seemed to go well, but don't get too excited, Edward whispered, pushing aside a disturbing memory. At the same time, Stacy lay in bed, thinking about her future. I wonder when Edward will propose to me. Or does he think I'll be his mistress forever? No, you won't, darling. That's not why I put up with your crazy son. Naturally, Edward didn't know all of this, and continued to naively believe that Penelope loved him sincerely, as he had once loved Vivie. The next morning after breakfast, Penelope walked into Voland's room. "So, little one, ready to go for a walk with me?" Voland looked at the nurse incredulously to see if she was joking. Those who had gone before her were afraid of walks like fire, and it was understandable. If something happened to the boy, who would be responsible? But Penelope persisted. A sheepint. The Orient. Well, Voland, are you going or not? The weather today is just great. Golden autumn. We'll go with you to collect leaves for the herbarium. What herbarium? The boy asked in surprise. Well, what kind of herbarium? For school crafts, applications. We'll collect fallen leaves with you. And then we'll take a thick book and put the leaves between the pages. I've always done that with my mom, Penelope explained calmly. Wow, that's great. Can we still go to the pond? They say there are lots of swans and wild ducks there. Penelope smiled. You can, of course. There's not only a pond of swans and geese. There are squirrels there too. Quite tame. When you give them a piece of breadcrumbs or a bagel, and they take it right from the palm of your hand. Voland's eyes became genuinely interested. The boy also looked at the nurse with respect. Penelope treated him like a normal, full-fledged child. No pity, no sugary sweet sympathy, paid for from the voluminous daddy's wallet. Penelope filled Voland's dress and rolled the stroller to the exit. Edward wasn't home, as he had gotten up at the crack of dawn, as usual in a hurry to get to the office. Stacy called out to them at the door. Where do you think you're going? All dressed up and pretty. We're going to the park to get some fresh air, Penelope replied. In the park? And why are you not sitting at home? The child is small and sick. And what if he will get worse? And responsible for this who? Are you going to be responsible? Stacy was indignant. She hadn't really cared about Woland for a long time. The point was different. Stacy had a sudden urge to show her power in the house, so that this girl would know who was the boss of the house. Penelope looked sadly at Woland, but the boy didn't want to give up. I can, if you like, call Papa and ask permission. But then I'll also tell him about how we got a delicious dinner on the table yesterday, and I'll remind him about the burnt eggs, too. Like Stacy's face flushed with anger. Okay, he wants to be bossy, that little handicapped kid. On the other hand, Stacy didn't want Edward to see her weaknesses. She'd never been a friend of the kitchen, and not only didn't like cooking, she didn't know how to cook. And all right, go ahead, just be careful out there, and don't linger near the water. It's not summer, Stacy said through gritted teeth. Voland looked at Stacy with a smile and winked. You know what you're doing, Auntie. It was a lovely walk. Penelope showed Volan the most beautiful places in the park, which she knew like the back of her hand. So they first fed the swans and ducks with bread. After that, Volan played with the tame squirrels. Looking at the boy's joyful face, Penelope could not hold back her tears. And maybe this is happiness, the very thing about which so much has been said. A child's laughter. Is it possible to replace it with something of equal importance? Hardly. "Are we going to the park tomorrow?" Volan asked. These words immediately brought her out of her agonized reverie. "We shall, of course, if it doesn't rain. You and I haven't collected any leaves today. So when I was little, we had a task for the summer at school to collect and dry leaves, and in the fall to prepare cones and chestnuts. And then we made crafts during labor lessons, hedgehogs, different animals." Wow. Interesting. And I'm not going to school until next year. That's what Daddy decided. But Aunt Stacy's against it. She says, "I'll have half a day of peace and quiet without you." "Hey, Auntie, how do you know the park so well?" Volan asked. The boy's question struck a nerve. It seemed to be a commonplace curiosity, but it was as if a black cat had run through his heart. "I spent a lot of time here, Volan. First as a student when I was at university, and then as an adult. I used to come here." Volan looked at Penelope in surprise. "I thought you didn't have to study to be a tramp." "Well, I've seen in movies that the street teaches them, and they also sleep in basements and beg for money all the time. But you're not like that. You're special." Penelope looked at the boy with undisguised amazement, still not knowing whether to laugh or be upset. Volan had quickly labeled her a tramp. Oh my God, it was so obvious. And Edward, did he think she was a homeless beggar? Realizing the awkwardness of her own situation, Penelope spoke the truth. "The truth. I'm not a tramp, Volan, and I don't live in a basement." "But that's understandable. You're in the room next door now," objected the lad. Penelope shook her hands. "Oh, you know everything. I was not always like this. I used to be an ambulance paramedic, just so you know." "Just like Dr. Abelet?" Volan persisted. "Yes, just like that. I used to go on calls, treat people, and in my spare time I walked in the park. I didn't write poems, but I did it for my soul." Volan looked at her respectfully. She was a good woman, that Aunt Penelope. Such a lady and a doctor. She can write poetry, and she knows a lot of things. "And then what happened?" asked the curious boy again. Penelope turned pale and furtively brushed away a tear. "I'm sorry, buddy. Let's do it another time, okay? It's a very grown-up story. You'll think it's not for children's ears. Just don't tell Daddy about it. It's unnecessary." Volan nodded peacefully. Why offend such a kind aunt? When Volan returned home, the first thing he did was to tell his father about the walk. Edward couldn't believe his eyes when he looked at his joyful son. He hadn't seen Volan this happy in a long time. "Penelope, you are a magician. I don't know what I would do without you," Edward said with feeling. Stacy looked at the nurse with hatred. If she had her way, that girl would be out of their house in no time. And this wasn't a house. Volan would have gone to a boarding school for children with disabilities. He's getting a little wild with his master's praise. Penelope's cheeks turned pink, and a slight smile played on her lips. Volan wanted to tell the story he had heard in the park, but then he stopped short, remembering his promise. Stacy's lips drew together into one solid line in anger. "Well, we'll see whose side it is," she said. a stray thought running through her head. Edward thanked his fiancée for dinner and went to his office. His competitors had been too active lately. Everything they did was in color, as if they knew all his moves ahead of time. But how is it possible? Is there a traitor in the ranks of the company's employees? And why not? You know you have a lot of envious people. Everyone thinks you're lucky. You just got married, and your wife died right away. Forgive me for saying so, but there's no such thing as coincidence. It's like your son-in-law was waiting for him to show up so he could give his soul to God, Jonathan said. Edward always reacted violently to such statements. What are you doing? Are you out of your mind? I loved Vivie, and I wasn't even thinking about her wealth. You may not believe me, but I was against the inheritance in the first place. I would have left it to Voland or some distant relative. Jonathan only shook his head and grinned. Oh, come on, don't be such a Robin Hood, either. He didn't want money. Who doesn't think about money nowadays? Especially the kind that falls from the sky right into your hands. Edward almost punched his companion in the face that time. He's not a nice guy, Jonathan. Only money, money, and more money. As if there was nothing but that in life. But Penelope was thinking about something else. How would she help Voland to get up from the wheelchair? How to shake up the boy so that he stopped focusing on his illness? What if she tried it like this? Okay, that's tomorrow. Today didn't seem likely to work. I'll get up early in the morning. I'll get it right before Voland wakes up, Penelope whispered with a smile and began to go to bed. She liked living in Edward's family, especially if she didn't pay attention to her mistress's negativity. However, Penelope understood. The businessman's fiancée was afraid to let the nurse come to the forefront and not overshadow her, the recognized prima donna. But Penelope herself looked at it with unconcealed irony. Could she compete with Stacy? It's ridiculous. A woman who has lost everything in life and a beauty, spending time in beauty salons and restaurants. The next morning, Penelope got up before everyone else and quietly slipped out of the house. She headed for a place where she could buy a puppy, a stray. Of course, Penelope knew that there was a small spontaneous market near the city station, where retired grandmothers sold herbs from their gardens. Craftsmen were selling products of their talent, and artists were selling all sorts of junk to the suffering. In the midst of this motley mass stood a man with a huge cardboard TV box. The bottom of the box was lined with a soft cloth to make the puppy sitting there more comfortable. The idea was that for a price, anyone could bring a puppy and leave it with the vendor. Situations could be very different. For example, a person found a foundling among garbage cans, but could not take it home. What do you know? Maybe the living space does not allow it, or he is allergic to animals. But the puppy needs to be adopted. You can't just leave him starving on the street. A shelter is a good thing, but it's not a rubber band either. There's not enough room for everyone. That's why there was a little man with a box at the market. He takes the puppies and then sells them to anyone who wants them for a symbolic 5 cents. And the demand is there, because the puppies are always fed clean and clean. How can you pass by such little puppies? Of course, even for the symbolic price of selling puppies, the peddler was in a constant loss. But the emotions of being able to place a baby in a new family did not compare to the temporary inconvenience and expense of keeping foster pets. Upon seeing this, the man smiled happily. "Oh, Penelope Smith has arrived," he said. Oh, come on, give me a break. It's nothing. Who's Penelope Smith to you? That's all in the past. I'm just Penelope now, the woman replied. Emmett nodded in agreement, but still remarked, "You'll always be Penelope to me, an ambulance station paramedic. If it weren't for that unfortunate incident, you and I would still be on call." Penelope frowned. Not raking up the past isn't necessary at all. I remember everything perfectly well as it is. You were the best orderly on my shift, and what happened then was my fault and no one else's. I got you fired, and you warned me. You saw the driver of that foreign car dying, and I went in anyway. You gave him a shot, and the patient was allergic to the drug. He was doomed anyway, so that's what the board proved. After the autopsy, they found a lot of alcohol in that businessman's blood. Thank God no one was hurt. Emmett turned pale and clenched his fist painfully. What do you mean no one was hurt? What about you and me? We got kicked out with a wolf's license. We had to stop practicing medicine. It was a high-profile case. The father of the victim was a big shot, so they put us on trial. They wanted to charge us with criminal negligence. And what was the negligence? That the poor guy had half a minute to live. We took a chance and tried to save him. Thanks to the judge and the lawyer, a good one, avoided criminal charges. Penelope looked into the former orderly's eyes and noticed tears in them. "Oh, Emmett, Emmett, Emmett. You're worthless," she said quietly. She thought sadly, but did not pursue the unpleasant topic further. "All right, enough already. We've talked about it 100 times. I'm sick of it myself. I'm actually here on business. I'd like more, Oberon." The former orderly raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Is that what I thought it was? Can I congratulate you, Penelope?" "No," the woman smiled. "You know, I had a pregnancy as a failure after all these events, so I cannot have more children. Husband because of this and left. He went to a young woman, filed for divorce. He's got the house for himself. I have nothing left. Anyway, I'm homeless now. But it doesn't matter. Show me the puppy." Emmett sighed heavily and began to show his former colleague the babies he had in stock today. After a short hesitation, Penelope sighted on a snow-white fluffy one with black ears and tail. After looking at him, it looked like someone had deliberately painted over those body parts to make adjustments to his appearance. Good choice. But I warn you at once, he will grow up big. He has in his relatives either a Labrador or an alibi. So take that into account, Emmett said. See how big his foot is? Only giants have such feet. Penelope smiled and gave her former colleague everything she had in her pocket. Emmett tried to refuse and return the money, but it was all in vain. "Goodbye. I'll drop by again. I'm sorry. I'm late for work." The nurse is looking after the boy, but not for long. Emmett looked at his former boss and turned his attention back to the babies in the box. When Penelope entered the room with a white puppy in her arms, Boland's joy knew no bounds. "Wow, what a handsome boy. Can I call him Snowball?" Penelope smilingly handed the baby to Voland. "You can, of course. Especially he is really white as snow. But here and brought a dog in the house. You should at least ask before making such decisions. Is he even vaccinated? What if he's got fleas or shingles or rabies? What then?" Stacy came into the living room. "Oh, come on. He's a normal puppy. A friend of mine gave him to me. He is mostly mongrels, but they're all vaccinated. He brings the vet to them once a week," Penelope objected. "You look, it really makes a difference. A mongrel, but also vaccinated. I'd never seen anything like this in the house before, Stacy exclaimed. Edward entered the living room at that moment as he was getting ready for work. What's all the commotion? We must have a new tenant. What's his name? Snowball. Daddy, can I keep it? Volan begged. Father smiled. You can, my friend, no problem. Why not? I even like the name, and the dog's a good dog. When Stacy heard his answer, she almost choked with anger. But she didn't resist. She went to her room. Voldemort put the baby on his lap and rode with him around the room in his stroller. Penelope looked at Edward with a smile, and he nodded approvingly. In his opinion, the nurse was definitely doing a solid A, maybe even an A+. On the way to work, Edward thought about the situation in his office. The thing was, he had made a very serious and well-hidden enemy. For the same reason, most of the deals he had made had failed. But the worst of it was that the information about future contracts was stored in Edward's personal safe. The same one that had been robbed not too long ago. Of course, the lock on the safe had been replaced with a newer and better one, but the fact remained. The information on his latest deal could have been leaked by someone either in the household or very close to him. But who? Could it be Penelope? And how? How could she have gotten the code to the safe? Edward's mood dropped noticeably. There was obviously something wrong with this nurse. And why wouldn't she tell me anything about her past? What if she was the mole? The timing and her strange behavior all matched. At that moment, a very interesting thought occurred to Edward. What if he installed hidden surveillance cameras in the house, but only secretly so that no one would know about them, not even Woland? No, he is not a mole, of course, but because of his age, he can easily give away everything he knows. The businessman liked the idea so much that instead of the office, he went to a large electronics store. The salesman patiently listened to him and then pointed to one of the models. Here, pay attention to this model. On the plus side, it has a fairly long battery life. The recording itself can be streamed in real time directly to your phone. Data storage is optional. You can upload to the internet, and you can upload to an internal storage device. Installation is very simple. No special skills are required for installation at all. Edward smiled contentedly. Oh, that suits me just fine, but I'd like to keep this purchase a secret. The salesman nodded understandingly, not forgetting to mention that their firm practiced complete confidentiality. It took Edward about an hour to install the cameras. The businessman was lucky, because that was when Voland, Penelope, and the puppy had gone for a walk in the city park, and Stacy had already been in the beauty parlor for the last hour to get even more effect from her unruly curls. Well, let's see what kind of fish I've got in my net, Edward thought with a smile. In case the cameras didn't work, he intended to install them in the office for the same purpose as at home. The wait was about 3 days. At first, there was nothing interesting on the tapes. The tenants behaved in the same way as before. Life went on as before. No special secrets or unexpected discoveries. But what Edward saw on the record of the 3rd day shocked him. He couldn't believe his eyes. The surprise was so intense that he was speechless for a while. And the fact was that his son Voland, left at home alone, had been walking quietly about the rooms. So his traveling in a wheelchair was a deception. Unable to contain his emotions, Edward headed for his son's room. When he saw Penelope there with the puppy, he asked the nurse to step out. "Dad, why are you doing this? Don't send Penelope away. I'll only talk to her," the boy begged, pale as a sheet. His father looked at the nurse and waved his hand. "Fine, let her stay. I have no secrets from her." especially not a secret that it's you who's keeping us." Wolin looked fearfully at Penelope. She smiled and shifted her gaze to Edward. "I apologize for switching to you again, but I have a rough guess as to what the conversation will be about." "And what do you think it's about?" Edward asked ironically. Penelope deliberately paused, then said, "It will be about the fact that your son is not sick at all and has been moving around like a perfectly healthy man for the past 6 months. And how do you know that?" "It's not like I've told anyone about it," Wolin exclaimed. Penelope smiled. "I noticed it from the house slippers, my friend. Whenever there were no adults in the house, they somehow changed their position." Wolin sighed sadly, and after some hesitation, he rose from his wheelchair, taking a few steps around the room. Edward watched his son without looking away, still not believing what was happening. Finally, realizing that all this was indeed reality and not a dream, he still asked, "Wolin, why? What's the point? This has all been going on for months now." Penelope immediately touched his shoulder, implying that the child should be spoken to more gently. Tears ran down Volin's cheeks. "It's all because of Stacy, Dad. You've been paying so much attention to her lately that if I even got out of the stroller, you'd completely forget about me. I really couldn't walk at first. And then when I got better, I started pretending, so you'd take care of me like you used to." Edward's heart trembled. Hugging his son, he lifted him easily into his arms and whirled him around the room. Penelope stood back and smiled. She had discovered Volin's deception almost immediately, but she did not reveal the little boy's secret. Let him decide when it is better to come out of the shadows and appear before everyone in a new image. "But then who was examining the documents in my safe?" Edward asked anxiously. Penelope shrugged her shoulders in confusion. Volin, on the other hand, had his suspicions. "Dad, it's Stacy. One day, when she thought everyone was asleep, I snuck into your office. The light was on, but you weren't at your desk." "And what happened next?" Father asked eagerly. Volin hesitated for a moment, and then, gathering his wits, said Stacy was in the study. She opened the safe somehow. She was also talking to some man on a video link. "What was his name?" "Hector. There's some name in there that's really weird. I can't remember. Maybe Jonathan."
"Sure about your own guess?" Edward asked.
"Ah, that's right. Jonathan. Jonathan for sure." Edward sank down in his chair with a groan. "What is this? There are traitors everywhere. Stacy, Jonathan, but what could possibly connect them?" That same day, Edward gave his fiancée a thorough interrogation. At first she'd refused, made a surprised face, but when Wolin rode into the room in a wheelchair and rose from it in a spectacular manner, she gave up and waved her hand. "It's all your late father-in-law's fault. Edward. Ben actually happens to be my biological father. For a while in his turbulent youth, he lived on 2 families, and as a result, he had 2 daughters, one legitimate, Vivie, and the other, like me, a gray mouse born into a sinful relationship. When my father died, not a muscle in my face quivered. 2 years earlier, I had buried my mother. She had drunk herself to death because of that lustful bugger, but justice was served. I've waited all these years for a reason. Vivie, my sister, went to the grave right after her father. I was getting ready to get the paperwork to prove my parentage when I found out that the fool had bequeathed all the Swan family money to you, the village fool." Edward's cheeks flared, but he held back. Stacy continued, "You've been on the stove for years, and you would have been for years if it hadn't been for that fool. You should have left everything to your husband. You're a country bumpkin, Look at you. You stink of dung from a mile away. Stop insulting my father, you bastard. Voland couldn't help himself. And Stacy said, no. I told Jonathan to come up with something original. He's a fool. He's trying to ruin you, because Edward's inheritance was a windfall. He took it by surprise. You should share it. It was his men who robbed you 2 years ago. You don't believe me. How do you think they got a detailed plan of the rooms in the house? They took a lot of money, but you got out of it. You got the insurance. You're lucky, Edward, Stacy snarled and headed for the exit. No one was going to stop her. What was the point? There was nothing to convict her of anyway. There was no evidence on hand, and the little boy's words were not going to stick. Edward sighed and walked over to Penelope and Voland, then hugged them both. Birds were singing to the businessman's heart that he had identified his enemies, and the black streak in his life was finally coming to an end. It was all the fault of money and envy. Jonathan was detained the very next day. Out of resentment and deep disappointment in her hapless lover, Stacy promised to testify against him. Edward had a new life, and Penelope took a special place in it. However, she was not a housewife for long, and with her husband's support, she opened a shelter for homeless animals. Emmett became its manager. Now people did not bring puppies to the market, but directly to the shelter, which had all the conditions for their stay. The puppies were given into good hands. Emmett, as he used to do, asked for a penny for food, but not for profit, but for the memory of the past, when he had used it, along with part of his earnings, to buy food and medicine for the puppies. As Emmett had promised, Snowball grew to the size of a calf and could easily knock a grown man off his feet. Voland went to school and brings home only good grades. At the same time, he calls Penelope Mom and stands up for her. He also brags to his friends that soon he will have a brother. Whether this is true or not, it is difficult to say, but judging by the noticeably rounded tummy Penelope, the words of the boy is not meaningless.
In the heart of the city, among the sights, luxurious flower beds and monuments, there was a prestigious and very expensive hotel. The top of its roof was visible from anywhere in the city, and from the observation deck you could see everything you wished. The surrounding area was always bustling with life. The elite of society settled inside the hotel, and those who did not dream of getting inside took photos of the luxurious facade side. Some just fantasized about getting at least a glimpse inside, and some were disdainful. The rich people there, they think they're aristocrats, some grumbled. Sven had been looking for a new job for a long time. Although he was young, he had a lot of experience in the hotel business. Not without problems, but he was hired at the same hotel as a doorman. Sven was intrigued. Like the rest of the townspeople, he had heard all sorts of rumors and suspicions. And so came his first day of work. Actually, it wasn't exactly his first day of work. Sven had been put on probation under the supervision of a more experienced employee, but his nerves were jittery, as if he was not at work, but at an audience with the president of the country. Donning his uniform, Sven stood at his post. He felt incredibly energized. He wanted to prove himself as soon as possible as an usher. Sven smiled broadly and asked his colleague what time does the flow of people usually start. His colleague turned out to be a young man named Dan. Like Sven, Dan was a doorman, but he would be leaving that position very soon, having decided to quit. He had been put as Sven's partner to train him. The look on Dan's face was bored and, to put it bluntly, dejected. He shrugged. Whenever Dan muttered. Sven frowned. Dan looked too relaxed. Sure, it was one of his last days on the job. However, the key word here was not last but working. A doorman has no right to be moody. He should be smiling, charming, helpful. And Dan? Dan was more like a security guard at a chain grocery shop in a dormitory neighborhood, not a doorman at a high-end expensive hotel. While the two of them were alone, Sven decided to ask, "What are you doing?" What Dan asked in surprise, leaning against the door. "Why should I be happy? I can't wait to get out of here," he mumbled back. Sven nodded understandingly, though he didn't really understand Dan at all. He couldn't understand how anyone could want to quit. Apart from the decent pay, this place was a dream come true in itself. When he went for the interview, he rather just wanted to be inside and didn't even expect to be accepted. He knew for sure that if he wasn't going to be fired, he wasn't going to leave. After some thought, he asked, "Can I ask you a question?" "Try," Dan said. "Why did you quit?" "Well, how can I put it? There are several reasons," Dan stretched out. Sven raised his eyebrows high in anticipation, looking at his colleague. Not wanting to ask clarifying questions, he waited for Dan to continue his thought. But Dan just remained silent. Apparently he didn't want to talk, but Sven was still curious. Without fear of sounding tactless, he asked, "So what are the reasons?" "It's not a good place." "Not a good place," Dan muttered. "Why are you surprised?" "I'm not surprised. More like confused." "What do you mean?" "That's what I mean. It's a tough place to work. The staff is a snake's tangle." Sven got a little nervous. "How does it manifest itself?" "You'll find out for yourself," Dan said. "Tell me," Sven asked. Dan made a disgruntled face, but didn't have time to answer. One of the hotel guests, a young and very pretty girl, appeared, smiled at the doorman, and asked them where they could go nearby. Sven hurried to fulfill his work duty. He told her where to go and what to see. When she was out of sight, Sven repeated his question. "What's wrong with this place? Tell me. I've got work to do here." "There's nothing to tell," Dan said. "The people here are fake. And I don't mean the visitors, I mean the employees, you know." "Honestly, not so much. Gossip, intrigue, backstabbing. There's a lot going on here. You know, when you said it wasn't a good place, I was thinking of something else," Sven admitted. Dan laughed merrily. "What did you expect to hear? That I'd tell you about the hotel being built in a graveyard?" Sven sneered. "Well, sort of. That's bollocks. I've heard all sorts of stories about it being a cursed place and blah, blah, blah. You know what the truth is? There's some really bad people working here. That's the secret." Sven made a neat point. "But you've worked here too." "I did. But as soon as I realized that the employees here were scheming, I quit." "How long did you work here?" "Not long." You couldn't say Sven was scared, but he was definitely a bit tense. "So you had an argument with someone?" "Yeah." "Is that why you decided to quit?" "Well, you could say that." "Who?" Dan gave Sven a disgruntled look and turned away. Sven realized that his mentor was in no hurry to share his secrets and decided to leave him alone. They stood in silence for about 10 minutes, and at the end of that time, Sven couldn't stand it any longer. "I take it you don't want to talk about the reasons for your conflicts, but to ask in a more generalized way, look, you're here to mentor me, aren't you?" "So?" Dan muttered. "Well, to mentor me, to give me advice. But more to the point, please tell me more about the local team. Is everyone here a real gossiping savage? It's a big group. Surely there are some normal people." "Normal," he repeated, rubbing his hands together thoughtfully. "Well, maybe there are, but what does it matter? There's no need to be afraid of them." "Then tell me, who should be feared? Who should be avoided? Who should not be contacted at all?" Dan squinted. "Benia, a lot of people. Like one of the waitresses at the restaurant, she's a bitch. Her name's Zoe. She's the only one here with that name. Don't even look in her direction. And she's like, ugh, I can't even remember her. What is she capable of? But you don't want to know." Sven frowned. There were more questions and fewer answers. After a moment's thought, he asked, "Is that all?" "No, I told you maybe it just didn't work out for me. You'll be fine. So you should avoid only the waitress. Avoid the security chief in the first place. He's a real SAR." Sven smiled. "Thanks for the warning. You think I'm joking? I'm dead serious. Never make eye contact with him. And if possible, don't talk to him at all. Pretend you don't exist." "Is it that serious?" "You have no idea how serious. I'm wrong about some things, but not this. Everyone's really scared of him." Sven's day at work was going well. His partner and mentor wasn't the most talkative person, but he was happy with him. Although Dan didn't say anything particularly interesting or important, Sven tried to listen to avoid Zoe and the security chief. The advice was interesting, but a little odd. Sven decided it was worth following, though he never quite understood why. The first day came to an end, followed by the second, third, and even the fifth. Slowly but surely Sven joined the local team, trying to seem like a nice and good-natured guy. And although it was too early to judge, Dan seemed more and more strange to Sven with each new day. Who did he have a fight with around here? Everyone who got in his way seemed to be very nice, pleasant people. Sven had almost finally come to the conclusion that the problem was Dan himself. But he still wondered why he had singled out two particular people. So Sven decided to find out more about it. Before the start of the shift, the newcomer accidentally met one of the representatives of the team, whom he had not seen before. It was a rather elderly woman who worked as a maid. Seeing her friendly look, Sven decided to have a little chat with her. "Hello, I'm new here. My name is Sven." She smiled at him and introduced herself. "Hello. You're the new doorman. It's good to have you here. That Dan, you know. My name is Samantha." "Nice to meet you, Samantha." Sven frowned. What's wrong with Dan? Can't communicate with him? He's not much of a talker, but he doesn't seem to be a bad person. "You don't know him very well," Samantha explained persuasively. "He's a young guy, but he acts like a market girl." "You mean he's a gossip? Haven't you noticed? I can't believe he hasn't told you any gossip." "He really hasn't. Although, to be honest, I did ask him to tell me a few things." Samantha eyed the newcomer incredulously. "And what? He didn't share anything with you at all?" Sven wondered if he should tell her. What if it was a secret? He folded his arms across his chest, looking down at his feet. Secret or not, Dan wouldn't be here anytime soon. And Sven really wanted to know about the waitress and the head of security. Getting more air into his lungs, he told Samantha everything he'd heard. When she heard the doorman, the maid laughed. "Dan's got it going on. Yes, Zoe is an angel. She's beautiful, clever, a polyglot. She knows 4 languages." Sven wondered. Why did he say that about her? He called her a bitch. Why? Because she'd put a spell on him. A spell. Well, it wasn't her. It was someone else who put a spell on her. And the other one, as it turned out, was protected. Sven raised his eyebrows as high as possible and couldn't help laughing. "Samantha, you're joking." "Would I joke about something like that? No, of course not. And I see you're one of those?" "What those?" "Well, what do you call yourselves, skeptics? You don't believe in hexing, do you?" "Well, it's not that I don't believe in it," Sven replied, trying not to offend her. "It's more like I don't trust it." "How did you realize it?" "How could I not? For a long time, Dan didn't notice her at all. Then he fell in love with her and chased her around like a dog. She even hid from him. That's why he quit. He couldn't handle the stress. The spell was strong. Can you imagine how bad he feels?" Sven said with a nervous chuckle. "To be honest, I don't. But I'll tell you, he feels very bad. That's why he's so glum. And who do you think did it?" "How the hell should I know? It's not a nice place." Sven smiled. "Not a good place, you say? You know, Dan said the same thing. He wasn't lying about that. The place is creepy. Shall I tell you the history of this hotel? Sven took a quick glance at his watch and, realizing there was still time, nodded. Of course you will. Well then, listen. Back in the last century, this hotel was built by a very rich man. There were terrible rumors about him in the society. They said he was afraid of daylight. Nobody knew how he made his fortune, nor did they know his biography. The hotel was built, opened, and then people started disappearing from it. Sven sighed heavily, but he kept his expression unchanged, trying to appear friendly. From the looks of it, it's Samantha who's not entirely rational, to say the least. She's one of those people who believes in ghosts and horoscopes, he thought. Sven decided to listen to the story, even though he realized it would be some kind of childish scare story, and asked, "Where did they disappear to?" One of the survivors told what had happened here. That rich man had built the hotel in such a way that there were many back doors behind its walls. He used the back doors to steal people and lock them in the basement. In fact, there's a whole underground city underneath the hotel. Really? Sven asked skeptically. Is there any confirmation other than rumors? Yes, of course. When the public found out, all the secret passages were concreted over. Some of them are still there, though. They're just hard to find. So the hotel is actually much bigger. The hidden part of the hotel is 2 or even 3 times bigger than the main part. But this, of course, no one alive today has seen. But it's the truth, Samantha replied deftly, looking around. I see. Why would the hotel owner want to steal people? She lowered her voice so that it was hard to make out what she was saying. The man who escaped saw a terrible thing. The owner was stealing people to drink their blood. He was a vampire. Sven couldn't hold back a nervous chuckle. Wow, he replied, although he really wanted to change the subject. He realized that Samantha was very peculiar, but to be so, Sven decided to change the subject. That's a very interesting story. So Dan lied about Zoe? Can we talk to her? You should. She's a very nice and interesting girl. What about the head of security? Dan said he's to be feared, avoided. He's dangerous to even make eye contact with. That's ridiculous. He's a security guard he's supposed to protect, not scare. Samantha got serious. He didn't lie to you here. It's true. Our head of security is best avoided. Sven wondered. What did he do? You don't want to know. Just always keep in mind that he's a dangerous man. Sven was so dumbfounded that he didn't know how to react. It seemed Dan and Samantha were completely different people. Their view of the hotel was radically different, and even the version about the waitress was dissimilar. Samantha had told him that the hotel was cursed, while Dan held a more earthy view. He believed it was the people who were the problem, and as different as they were, they agreed on one thing: the head of security, as silly as it sounded, was dangerous. Sven was beginning to worry in earnest, but his interest in the guard's persona had certainly grown, wondering what he had done wrong. Sven said a quick goodbye to Samantha and hurried to his workplace. Dan, as always, stood at the door with a disgruntled look. Where have you been? He asked. I met a maid. Which one? Dan pushed himself off the wall and was now on his feet. Samantha. You know, the older lady. And that psycho. Did she tell you the story about the vampire owner? There was silence for a few seconds, and then they laughed at the same time, and Dan said, Well, yes, the legend is certainly above board. What do you think of the underground city? That's my favorite part. I like the vampire part better, Sven said with a laugh. Yeah, I wonder if she's Samantha. Nothing interesting. Just uneducated and a bit crazy. What else did she say? Sven couldn't resist sharing. That you're wearing a spell. Dan smiled. Ah, that. But she always finds some magical explanation. So you had something with Zoe that made you dislike her so much. We didn't have a thing. She was just being a big shot. Swan. Did you like her? Well, not that I liked her, but yeah, I wanted to court her and she rejected you. Is that why you quit? No, it wasn't that. But she rejected you, yeah. I don't care about her. She thinks too highly of herself. But it's clear. What's clear to you? Why you're so angry with her? It's not that. Shit. Come on, I don't want to talk about it. With each new day, Sven got to know his team better and better. Dan and Zoe's story had finally been sorted out. It was true, Dan had his eye on a pretty waitress, and she'd rejected him, and in a rude way. It explained a lot of things, like why he disliked her and why Samantha, who loved mysticism and fairy tales, had found such a strange explanation for his crush. Sven was a sociable man and often chatted with one of his colleagues. Gossip was present, of course, and some were openly confrontational at all. Other than that, however, things weren't too bad, at least not as bad as Dan had described it. Ordinary people, just like everywhere else. But one question in particular began to plague Sven: what's wrong with the head of security? And even though he never got to meet him, he decided to find out anyway. He didn't know how. The probationary period came to an end and Sven was officially hired. By this point, Dan had finally allowed himself to leave the workplace, which made Sven upset. Although they wouldn't have been friends in normal life, he was a little more fun to be with at work. Sven decided he needed a new friend. During lunch, Sven met another new face. He turned out to be one of the receptionists. Deciding that this was a perfect match for friendship, Sven cheekily sat down next to him. Hi, my name's Sven. I'm the new doorman. We've met, he replied blankly. My name is Tom. I don't really remember. Of course you don't. You've got so many people passing through you. How can you remember any one person here? Mind if I join you for lunch? Well, you've already sat down. Sven laughed to smooth things over a bit and hurried off to make conversation. It's a good day today. Personally, I've only come across very nice people. Yes, that's rare in our line of work, Tom replied. How are you doing? Tom threw his fork on the table rather rudely. Sven, can I ask you a question? Sure. How do you never get tired? All you do all day is talk to people. Don't you want to be quiet at least at lunchtime? Well, no, Sven admitted. Why? I see. Are you the chatty type? He shrugged. Well, I guess. Tom tapped his fingers on the table. I'm not. Sven nodded, as if to let him know he wasn't offended. Tom, okay. I won't bother you. Thank you. Sven started to eat, but a little while later he spoke up again. Listen. Tom was really pissed off. What else? I like Dan better. Sven smiled guiltily. You two are so much alike. You're both so quiet. What did you want to ask? I've heard a rumor that our head of security is a bit strange. Tom looked round fearfully and spoke in a low voice. He's not weird, he's scary, really scary. You haven't seen him if you're asking questions like that. By the way, no, I haven't seen him yet. Is it true that you should avoid him? Yes, 100%. Sven smiled. Is it true there are vampires around here? You've been talking to Mrs. Samantha, haven't you? Yeah. Right. Well, I'm not telling you anything about vampires. Why not? Don't you believe Samantha's legend? It's not her legend. Samantha didn't invent it. There's a lot of talk about it. Well, do you believe it? Not that I believe it. I don't know. I'm a person who doesn't take anything on faith in advance, Sven replied. Interesting. So what about the head of security? Nothing. Just avoid him. He's a dangerous man. Damn it. But why does everyone talk about it, but no one can explain it? Tom smiled weakly. You'll understand once you see him. Hell yeah. Who the hell is he? Just a little more, and I'll think he's the creator of the Vampire Hotel. Well, look. Imagine a big 2-meter tall man with broad shoulders, bald and very strong ex-military, pumped up, perpetually disgruntled, with a giant scar all over his face. Tom drew the image. Sven clapped his hands unconsciously. Yep. Well, that's what he looks like. Now, add to that image the knowledge that he's a man of hard luck, bitter at everyone and everything. So would you sit down to lunch with him? Sven scratched the back of his head. I don't feel like it. Well, there's a reason you're so scared of him. He's really something to be afraid of. Interesting, Sven said. I don't know, I don't think so. Tom shrugged his shoulders. Now we can eat in silence. The intrigue of the security chief's identity was growing like a snowball. Sven had no doubt now that he was to be feared. He was going to avoid him, but he could not forget him. What kind of a fate had he suffered? Sven decided to talk to someone who might know the life story of this mysterious man. From one of the floor clerks on duty, he inquired, "Who has worked here the longest?" And in response, he heard a name. Miss Caroline, the head of administration. He could only hope that she would be more talkative. Just in case, he asked the desk clerk, "What do you think of the head of security?" To which he received an exhaustive answer. "He's like a shark. It's better not to mess with him. And if you do, it's best not to piss him off." Sven was able to see Miss Caroline 3 days later after he'd spoken to the duty officer. The evening shift was coming to an end, and Sven found her in one of the workrooms. From afar, she seemed a good candidate for conversation. Wide smile, straight posture, neatly styled hair. Maybe it was the cost of the profession, one must always exude friendliness. But it was as if Sven had sensed that she would be a good person to talk to. And he was right. "Hello, I'm new here." "A doorman?" she asked. "Yes, hi. Nice to meet you." "My name is Caroline," she replied. "Nice to meet you. Are you busy?" "No," she said in a friendly tone. Sven almost shrieked with joy and sat down next to her. "How are you?" "I'm fine, thank you. And yours? By the way, how do you like it here?" "Well, you know, it's pretty much as I imagined it would be. It's all kind of mystical, isn't it? Whoever I talk to, I get all sorts of information. Some say that the people working here are evil, to put it mildly, and some tell stories that make your blood run cold, and some are just strange. I haven't had a chance to get to the bottom of it yet. But overall, how do you like it here?" "Overall, I guess, yeah, but these vampire stories." Mrs. Caroline laughed. "I think I know who you've been talking to. Do you believe in all that?" "Of course I don't. It's all nonsense." "Thank God." Sven was relieved. There are a lot of people who do believe in it, as it turns out. Well, they're just bored. But, you know, Sven, it's better that way than that way, right? "Yeah, I suppose you're right. Can I ask you a question?" "Sure." "Is it true you've worked here longer than anyone else?" "Well, you could say that. I'm one of the old-timers." "Oh, that's great. Tell me, can I ask you about someone in particular?" "Not vampires, I hope." Caroline smiled. "No, the head of security." "Who is he?" Mrs. Caroline's face changed. "Ugh. That's a very complicated man." Sven shook his head. "God," he exclaimed. "Why is that? Why does everyone talk about him like that?" "Well, because that's the way he is," she said and smiled weakly. "Don't mess with him. And stop asking about him. It'll get to him sooner or later. And anyway, forget it." "Who the hell is he, this head of security?" Sven asked nonchalantly. "Can you at least tell me his name and what his fate is?" "His name is Michael, but you should address him as Mr. Michael. Although, of course, it's best not to talk to him." "Why not? Do you know anything about his hard fate?" Mrs. Caroline looked round. "I know. Tell me, can you keep a secret?" "Of course I can," Sven replied excitedly. If I don't find out what's wrong with him, I'll go crazy. All I know is that Mr. Michael is unsociable. Most of our team is afraid of him and treats him, shall we say, not in the best way. A lot of people know about his plight, but nobody knows what exactly happened to him. Everyone thinks he's just venting negativity on everyone because of what happened to him. That's basically what it is. But you do know something specific about him, don't you? Yes, I do. Michael and I knew each other in the past. We were both employed at this hotel by the same man, a mutual friend. So this Mr. Michael is one of the old guys like you? Sven asked. Yes. As I said, Mr. Michael is quiet, but he treats me better than the others, so he told me a little about himself. Sven snickered. Apparently it's a mystery behind 7 seals. Actually it is, but I can see you're so interested in him. I'll tell you Mr. Michael's story in return for you promising not to tell anyone, and at least try not to judge him. Thank you, I won't tell anyone, I promise. All right then. In general, Mr. Michael, former officer of special services, held in the Department of Own Security, not the last position, received good money, was married to a good girl who gave birth to his son. Everything was great, so much so that Mr. Michael relaxed. And one day at one of the corporate parties, he fell madly in love with another girl, let's say, with low social responsibility. I don't know what it was about her, but Mr. Michael literally lost his head. Samantha would say he was bewitched. But we know that's not true. She must have been a skilled manipulator, maybe some kind of hypnotist. I don't know. He started courting her immediately, and in the end he was ready to do anything for her, even to leave his family with a child. His wife understood but pretended not to notice, and for nothing. After all, in the end, that second girl set him a condition to kick out his wife or she will leave him. And Mr. Michael was so in love that without a second thought agreed to this terrible act. At that moment, he did not know that his wife was already pregnant with their second child, and when he found out, he convinced her to have an abortion. He left his wife with a child in her arms alone in a strange city, because she was a visitor. He brought his mistress into the house and married her, and forgot about his former family. What happened to his wife is a mystery. Mr. Michael doesn't know, and neither do we. But it was probably because of this act that Mr. Michael's life was in trouble. After a couple of years, he got bored with his beauty, and she started cheating on him left and right, and he put up with it. He was in love. It got to the point where she was having an affair with his boss. Can you imagine the kind of person she is? She turned Mr. Michael's boss's head, and eventually he was scandalously sacked. But Mr. Michael never gave up hope. He tried to get a job somewhere else, spinning like a squirrel in a wheel, afraid of losing his beloved. And that fear didn't endear him to his ex-wife's new boyfriend. He was beaten to a pulp, and that girl left him. He was in intensive care, and when he woke up, he realized he'd lost everything. He had lost his flat, all his money, and of course his beloved. And so he was left with nothing, no job, no home, and no prospects. An old friend of Mr. Michael's, a mutual acquaintance of ours, took pity on him and helped him get a job here as head of security. Whatever Mr. Michael's personal life, he's a good worker. And now he lives on the outskirts of New York, in a tiny flat, works here, and that's it. It's not an easy fate, but it seems worthy of its owner. Sven opened his eyes wide. Wow. I was expecting something else. Well, how is it? Miss Caroline remarked. Of course he's offended at the world after that. Sven tilted his head to the side. Well, I suppose. But it's his own fault, really, isn't he? Yes, I suppose so, agreed Mrs. Caroline. But I think he's paid the price too harshly. Where's his wife? You know, the first one who gave him the baby. Mrs. Caroline shrugged her shoulders. I don't know, and nobody knows. Well, have I satisfied your interest? She asked. Sven decided to think for a moment before answering. Although he expected something different, he felt he was glad to know the answer to his question. It wasn't really the head of security that interested Sven. In fact, it wasn't just him. He wanted so much to know the secrets of this place, why everyone talked about it, what the wide doors of the hotel hid. It was only after all this time that he realized it held no secrets. It's all people's fault. Every man has his own special destiny. Yes, thank you for telling me, said Sven. I won't tell anyone. That's good, Mrs. Caroline said. She looked over Sven's shoulder and her eyes widened. Wow, we were just talking about him. There he is. Where? Mr. Michael walked into the staff room. The door swung wide open, and the thud of the door hitting the wall made everyone in the room wince. All eyes were fixed on Mr. Michael, but he didn't care about that. He swept everyone present with his crowning glare and found his target the head of administration named Mrs. Caroline. With a confident stride, Mr. Michael made his way towards her, ignoring everyone else. He was so sick of everyone looking at him like he was some kind of superstar, and when Mr. Michael gave them his crooked stare, they shamefully hid their eyes. Idiots, he thought. They'd be better off with themselves than with this silly gossip. Mr. Michael didn't know if that mystical first hotelier existed, but with each new day he realized that he was getting more and more fed up with these tales. If it were up to him, he would send these fools down to the basement. As he approached Mrs. Caroline, he noticed only now that she was not alone. Opposite her sat some kid, afraid to lift his head. His softness and fearfulness made Mr. Michael angry. "Who's that?" he asked the receptionist. "This is our new doorman. Name's Sven," she replied. Mr. Michael glared at the boy, expecting him to at least look back at him. But the puny boy was staring at his feet and shaking. "Hey, doorman, get out of here. Grown-ups need to talk," Mr. Michael said gruffly. Sven rose slowly to his feet. "Sure, I'm sorry," he mumbled and ran away. Mr. Michael flopped down in his seat, though the chair was a little small for him, to say the least. Mrs. Caroline sighed heavily. "Why did you scare Sven? He doesn't seem a bad boy." "Just to let him know," said Mr. Michael dryly. "That's why everybody's afraid of you. Do you know they really do scare the newbies with you? And thank them very much for that." Mr. Michael replied loudly, "At least some good came from the gossip and I stopped being harassed by those freaks." "Were you looking for me?" Mrs. Caroline asked, shaking her head. "Yes," replied Mr. Michael. "Is something wrong?" "Yes, something important is going to happen at our hotel very soon." "Yes, what is it?" Mr. Michael lowered his voice. "There's going to be a wedding." "Oh, good. Is it a secret? Why are you whispering?" "No, but I don't want our staff to get overexcited." "Michael, I don't understand you." "Well, a wedding is a wedding. It feels like a first time." "It's about the groom. It's our mayor." "What?" It's Mrs. Caroline couldn't finish the word because Mr. Michael had his hand over her mouth. "Shut up, will you?" "Yes, the mayor of our town." She pushed the rude man away and said, "I'm just shocked. That's why it's best to keep a low profile. We're preparing little by little and keeping the team calm." "Who's the bride?" Mr. Michael shrugged. "Nobody knows. That's the real mystery right there. I've been looking on the internet, and from what I gather, she's carefully hiding her identity. I wonder why she would do that. Why not reveal herself right away? Everyone will find out who she is sooner or later anyway." Mr. Michael frowned. "Don't you realize? It's the bloody mayor. Do you have any idea how much power he has and how much money? People like that are protective of their personal lives, and for good reason. It's usually the people closest to them that they manipulate." "You mean he's hiding his fiancée because he's afraid for her?" "Yeah, I guess he is." "Okay, well, I get it. Let's get ready and keep it quiet about whose wedding it's going to be. By the way, what are you worried about? Nobody's talking to you anyway." "That's not what I'm worried about. It's days like this when you have to be on your guard. Politics is like a red rag to a bull for terrorists." "Oh, now I'm nervous." Chuckles, "Yeah. Well, anyway, get ready," Mr. Michael said and stood up abruptly. He left the room as quickly as he had entered it. He slammed the door against the wall, and at the end of it, he gave everyone a disgruntled look at how much he hated them all. But of course, he hated himself first and foremost. Mr. Michael had lost everything. And more importantly, how so stupid and so ridiculous to lose everything because of some girl. Mr. Michael was well aware that he had ruined more than one life. He walked towards his office, noticing perfectly well how they were afraid of him. They hid their eyes, turned away, pretended not to notice him. What morons they all are, he thought. Mr. Michael had always dreamed of going somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Already on his way to his workplace, a beautiful long-haired girl, so familiar, swept past him. His heart raced and he called out to her. "Jane, Jane, stop." But the girl went on ahead. Mr. Michael flushed with emotion and followed her with a firm step. He grabbed her roughly by the shoulder, forcing her to turn round. "Jane, you've got me confused with someone else. Keep your hands to yourself," she said. Mr. Michael jerked as if slapped and took a step back. It wasn't Jane. It was the one that had crossed his mind most often in recent years. Jane was the name of his first wife, sweet and gentle and so kind. It was only after losing everything that Mr. Michael realized how wrong he'd been. But nothing could be changed. He remembered her only after he was left with nothing, dreaming of her beauty, kindness, and obedience. He remembered what a wonderful cook she was, what a marvelous hostess she was, and no matter how hard Mr. Michael tried, he could never find her. He thought of Jane every day, went to sleep, and woke up thinking of her. He could always see her in the crowd, dream about her. And though Mr. Michael knew that she would never forgive him, he longed to look at her once more. He had his own son, his only son. And Mr. Michael had traded him in for some cheap girl. Looking at the girl who looked so much like Jane, he felt his heart constrict. This isn't her, Mr. Michael thought. He walked into the office, sat down and thought, why did I ever think I could recognize her? After all these years, she must have changed a lot. Maybe her hair wasn't as long. Maybe she'd changed the way she dressed, learned to wear heels. Mr. Michael grimaced. How many times can I bring her up? It was like there was nothing else to think about. He tried to put her out of his mind and even succeeded. But the intrusive thoughts were replaced by the memory of his son. He must be over 20 now. Mr. Michael shook his head. We need to focus on the wedding. He called his boss to discuss future events. A few days later, everyone knew about the wedding. The staff was almost torn as they discussed the future guests, some wondering who the bride would be. Some wanted at least a glimpse of the mayor, but Mr. Michael didn't give a damn. He made his way through the crowd of colleagues, not forgetting to push with his rock-hard shoulders. What are you all piled up here for? He asked in a voice that sounded like thunder. The colleagues fell silent. Mr. Michael glared at them contemptuously, waiting for some daredevil to take the lead. What are you standing there for? Get out. Mr. Michael growled. The maids, waitresses, doormen, and many others parted. Clenching his fists, he headed down the path set aside for him. Suddenly he heard an unfamiliar voice. The representative of the wedding customers is arriving once again today. We're interested in seeing him. Mr. Michael became furious. Who said that? He asked, turning round sharply. The doorman took an uncertain step forward. It's me. My name is Sven. You better stay out of my way. Mr. Michael growled. Well, you asked, Mr. Michael said the doorman. I don't care. You're just standing here like idiots to see some representative. You're just sick. But there was a woman's voice. The rep is so cute. Zoe, shut up, Mr. Michael whispered. He did not continue the conversation and quickly left the corridor where the crowd had formed. He heard shouts of admiration for the representative. He's so handsome, young, and rich. I hope he'll look at me, and so on. The door slammed shut, cutting Mr. Michael off from this annoying muttering. I think the female half of the staff have gone mad, he thought. Mr. Michael was angry, though he didn't understand why the workday was going on as usual. He was minding his own business when suddenly he accidentally bumped into someone he had never seen before. He was a tall young man, not expecting to be hit by a big man like himself. The stranger jumped aside. Hey man, watch it, he exclaimed. Of course, Mr. Michael had not expected such impertinence. He slowly turned round and gave a wolfish stare. "Say that again." Look where you're going," said the young man, rubbing his bruised shoulder. "Who are you?" Mr. Michael asked him firmly. "Who are you? Why are you acting like this? What are you, the center of the earth?" Mr. Michael closed his eyes, counting to 5, 1, 2, 3. A long time ago, a psychiatrist he knew had taught him how to calm down so he wouldn't make a scene. 4. Mr. Michael opened his eyes sharply. "Shut your mouth, puppy, before I smash you against the wall," he growled. "Uncle, you're out of your mind. Maybe I should get you some pills." Joked the stranger. Mr. Michael couldn't stand it and pinned the insolent man against the wall, using only one arm. The young man hung in the air, beginning to suffocate. "Let go." "Who are you?" "Just another night doorman. Didn't they teach you to speak to those above your rank?" he hissed. "I represent the interests of the wedding," he said in a low voice. Mr. Michael released his hand, and his companion fell to the floor, breathing heavily. "What are you doing?" he asked, panting. "Don't forget who you're talking to." Mr. Michael spat out the words and started to leave. But he didn't. From somewhere in the distance came the familiar disgruntled voice of the supervisor. "What's going on here?" The representative, barely breathing, pointed his finger in the direction of Mr. Michael. "That man, he's rabid. He almost strangled me," said the victim. The boss flew over to him, helped him up, and apologized. "I'm sorry, for God's sake. I'm sorry. It's our security guard." "Are you kidding me? He's the one you should be guarding everyone from." "I'm sorry, we'll fire him. I'll find someone who can help you." The hotel manager made a quick call, and in a couple of minutes a pretty girl appeared in the corridor where the altercation had taken place. She took the injured man under the elbow and led him away in an unknown direction. Mr. Michael and his boss were left alone. "What is this?" asked the disgruntled boss. "What?" mumbled Mr. Michael. "What the hell is this? So everyone's afraid of you, Michael. You, and you're our head of security, by the way. You've intimidated the staff, fine, but you're already lashing out at the guests, and that's out of line." Mr. Michael mumbled something to himself. "I want you to act like a human being," the boss continued. Mr. Michael rolled his eyes. "I'm acting normal. This guy asked for it." "You ask for everything. Do I have to fire you or what?" Mr. Michael chuckled. "Well, if you promise that ghoul, then go ahead." The manager hesitated. "Shit, you know I wouldn't go for that, don't you?" "Yeah, I suspect not." "Of course you're valuable. Where else would I find someone like you?" He scratched his chin. "This conversation is over. I've got to go, but promise me that was the last time," the boss said. Mr. Michael promised nothing. He knew himself well. He couldn't help himself when he was being rude. With his usual firm step, he went back to the office and tried to forget about it. After all, such an important event for the whole hotel was right around the corner. The day of the wedding had arrived. The hotel literally stood on its ears from the very early morning began to arrive such guests, at the sight of which even the most steadfast workers lost their grip. Singers, actors, comedians, politicians, artists. It seemed that the best of the best had been invited to this celebration. Waitresses turned up their noses in the hope that some celebrity would pay attention to them. The cooks were going crazy at the cooker, realizing the risk of making a mistake. The maids ran around, peering with interest into the faces of the guests. Even the guards, Mr. Michael's subordinates, were staring at the visitors. Everyone was delighted. Everyone except Mr. Michael. To him, all this pomp seemed too gaudy and overly flamboyant. As much as Mr. Michael would have liked to leave, he wanted the day to come to an end, but he had to work, and work well. From a security point of view, this day could have brought a lot of trouble. The guests were very important people, and Mr. Michael knew better than anyone else that such people had to be guarded with the utmost care. For ordinary visitors, rich though they were unlikely to be of much interest to anyone. Politicians, on the other hand, should always be in the public eye. Mr. Michael watched the faces of those who came in while his guards were examining suspicious items. He was busy assessing the overall situation. In this kind of confusion, someone dangerous could sneak in. No matter how Mr. Michael felt about his colleagues and his guests, he still knew for sure that anything, even his own life, would be sacrificed for the safety of those around him. Staring at the camera monitor, Mr. Michael's heart thudded. He thought he saw a familiar face. No, it wasn't Jane, but someone connected to her. The girl skipped past those annoying guards and the new doorman, scrutinizing the interior. No wonder, as far as Mr. Michael remembered, that lady lived rather poorly. Then what was she doing here? Mr. Michael strained to remember her name. Isabella, perhaps? No, he would never remember whether it was Isabella or not. It didn't matter at all, for it was not the name that interested Mr. Michael. This girl he saw was Jane's best friend. They were in the same class. He'd only seen her a few times in his life at a wedding and his wife's birthday party. What are the chances that Mr. Michael wasn't mistaken? And if he wasn't wrong, what was she doing here? After a little thought, Mr. Michael jumped up from his seat, and a couple of minutes later was standing in front of the doorman, looking down at him. "What's your name?" "Sven?" Mr. Michael asked irritably. "Sven," the man replied. "How's it going?" "What?" "None of your business," Mr. Michael retorted. "All right, and I've got." "Shut up." Sven obediently shut up. Mr. Michael counted to himself and then raised his voice again. A girl with a short haircut and white hair just walked by. "Got it, Mr. Michael. To be honest, I don't have such a good memory." "Well, put it to the test." Sven thought for a moment. "Well, it's a bit simple, isn't it? I wondered what she was doing here." "Yes," agreed Mr. Michael. "What did she say? What did she ask?" "Oh, nothing much. She asked where the toilet was." Mr. Michael pressed his lips together. "Shit," he frowned. Sven asked, embarrassed. "Why, do you know her?" "Why do you care?" Mr. Michael cut him off. He was silent for a moment, and then he said, "You know, I think you should let it go." "What? What are you talking about?" Mr. Michael didn't understand. Mr. Michael was ready to explode. Did this guy really know something? He was already clenching his fists before he could count to 3. But the work radio made such a sound that Mr. Michael knew it was no good. He rushed towards the guard post, knocking down everyone in his way. This sound is used only in extreme cases. He arrived on the scene and immediately asked, "What's wrong?" "Mr. Michael, there's trouble." Unknown persons called with the message that there is a bomb in the restaurant hall. "Oh shit," he cursed. "Did you get the number?" "Begin evacuation," a voice said. "Calm down," Mr. Michael interrupted. "First, we have to make sure that the information is not false. That is, while we're sitting tight, you be vigilant. This message could be a distraction." They gave the coordinates of the bomb, where it is, someone said. "Yes, but they could have lied," Mr. Michael replied. "Good. Wait for instructions. I'll check it carefully. I don't want to cause a panic. Call the bomb squad." Mr. Michael rolled his eyes as he put on his pre-prepared waistcoat. "Stay in touch. I'm on my way." He tried his best to keep a straight face as he stepped inside the banquet hall. The wedding was in full swing. The music, the noise. All the politicians and celebrities were dancing, singing, shouting toasts. Mr. Michael grimaced. They're rich, but they're acting like savages, trying not to arouse suspicion or cause unnecessary panic. He went to the coordinates he had sent to check for a bomb. In general, Mr. Michael was calm. Having vast experience in law enforcement agencies, he knew very well as a rule, information about a bomb is false. With a keen eye on all the places where it could theoretically be, Mr. Michael breathed a sigh of relief. "They lied," as always, he said into the radio. Mr. Michael checked everything thoroughly several times and said there was no bomb. He was about to leave when he noticed a familiar face. The same friend of Jane's he had seen on the cameras was standing next to the bride, gesticulating vigorously and obviously telling her something. He frowned, heading in her direction. Why? He hadn't decided yet. He walked towards her with a firm step, when suddenly that lady flew off in an unknown direction, leaving his fiancée alone. Mr. Michael paused, wondering if he should approach the bride. Probably some pompous girl, and she wouldn't want to talk to him. He stared at the bride's back, then looked closer at the groom. The mayor was sitting at the table, talking to someone. Mr. Michael stood back, watching them, while the bride danced alone. For some unknown reason, but he looked her over with an appraising eye. There was something vaguely familiar in her movements. Suddenly she turned round to face him, and Mr. Michael was stunned. It was Jane himself. Mr. Michael had imagined this moment so often that he had forgotten how to breathe, and earlier he'd thought he couldn't recognize her. No, he would recognize her out of 1,000. His heart was pounding, and Mr. Michael, on the other hand, froze, not knowing what to do. Was his ex-wife the same one he had left with nothing alone marrying the mayor? How could that be possible? Jane danced until she was tired. She stepped aside, and Mr. Michael knew it was time to act. It seems that the bomb information was nothing more than a joke by some idiots. So he could afford to relax, even just a little. On woozy legs, he walked over to her, not knowing what to say. She had changed so much. Her hair was shorter, her lips chubbier than before, and apparently she'd learned to walk in heels after all. "Jane," he whispered in a shaky voice. If anyone saw him now, they certainly wouldn't recognize Mr. Michael. Jane frowned and gave him a brief glance. "Do we know each other? Who are you?" He took a step forward. "Yes." She looked him over from head to toe. "Are you the security guard? Is something wrong?" "No, it's me, Michael." "Michael who?" Jane asked, perplexed. Mr. Michael's face changed. "Oh, it's you?" she exclaimed. "I am," he replied, averting his gaze. His conscience had been awake for some time, but now it came to him once more. The shame consumed Mr. Michael, and he said, faintly but still quietly, "I'm sorry." She snorted. "I don't want to." Tears glistened in the eyes of the huge, bald, scarred Mr. Michael. "I understand, but at least you'll think about it sometime," she replied dryly. Maybe she replied dryly. "What are you doing here?" "Working." "And I take it you're getting married?" "I already am," Jane smirked. "Where's your sweetheart?" "I have no idea." "You don't?" I could hear the sarcasm in her words. "Where's our son?" "Our son? You mean my son? He won't even remember you, and you're nothing to him." Mr. Michael was prepared to take any insult from her just to be near her. He decided to change the subject. "Jane, how did you do it?" "What? Get married?" She laughed. "Did you think you were going to make me cry for the rest of my life?" "No, I was just wondering how you managed it all." "I worked." Steadfast, she replied. "Long and hard. My friends gave me money, I rented a flat, got 2 jobs. I was a salesman by night and a travel agent by day. That's where I met my future husband, by the way." "The mayor came to you to pick out a tour?" "Yes, that's right. Is there anything else you wanted?" "I have to get back to my guests." Many questions were on his tongue, but Mr. Michael decided to ask something distant. "Ah, that's what that white rat was doing here. What's her name, Isabella?" "Emma is my best friend, and don't you dare call her that." Jane flared up. "I'm sorry, I saw her on the cameras and I was surprised. I wondered what she was doing here. I thought she couldn't afford a place like this. And she's a bridesmaid." "Interesting?" "That's right. Emma flew in from our hometown for my wedding, and I'll be grateful to her for the rest of my life, because she was the one who saved me, gave me money, supported me, worried. That's how some women turn out to be much more courageous than men." "That's right," Mr. Michael said. "I hope she's doing well. And you too." Yeah, I'll go, Jane said. I don't even know why I'm talking to you after everything you've done. I just wanted to apologize for everything. Jane put her head down, but suddenly a rather rough voice made her turn round. Mum, get away from him, shouted a young man familiar to Mr. Michael. He's a psychopath, and he nearly strangled me. Mr. Michael realized, in the one who had called Jane Mum, he recognized the representative of the wedding planner he had clashed with recently in the corridor. He folded his arms across his chest and looked defiant. At the same time, Jane asked in surprise, John, what are you doing? Mr. Michael's jaw almost dropped. After Jane had called him by his first name, the simple truth came to him. He'd almost strangled his own son in the corridor. He wanted to fall to the ground in shame. At the same time, John approached Mr. Michael and looked him contemptuously in the eye. What the hell are you doing here? You should have been sacked. Mr. Michael didn't break eye contact, but he wasn't in the mood for an argument. He put his hand on John's shoulder under the surprised looks and squeezed it. Son. John laughed, brushing his hand off. Man, what are you? He looked at Jane. Mum, John sighed heavily. Is it true? Look at it. There he is, your father, she said mockingly. The same one who left us, who threw his pregnant wife and baby out on the street. Is that how you imagined him? There he is. John wrinkled his nose. Yes, I'd be glad not to know him. Mr. Michael blushed, turned pale. Even he had literally no words to try to defend his honor in just a few minutes. His conscience, however, would not even allow him to open his mouth in their direction. He lowered his head, deciding that he was worthy of any insults. But there were none, for at the same second there was a loud, chilling clap. Mr. Michael knew that sound well. While the artists and politicians, who knew only the good life, turned their heads, he got down to business. The minutes counted. Grabbing his ex-wife and son under his arms, he began to lead them, covering them, towards an emergency secret exit. Jane stopped understanding anything and blindly followed her ex-husband, and John tried to break free. What's going on? But his mother quickly made him realize that this was no time for jokes. Follow your father now. All this lasted only a couple of seconds, but Mr. Michael quickly realized what was going on. Long before the main villains appeared, armed terrorists burst into the banquet hall. The guests screamed in terror. Someone fainted. Most of them rushed to the exit, but the way was blocked. A terrorist, probably the ringleader, fired a machine gun into the ceiling. It down on the ground. But they didn't yet know who they were messing with. There was someone in the banquet hall who was out of their league. Mr. Michael knew at once what had happened. The terrorists had called in false information to distract the guards from the main action. Once they got rid of the guards, they planned to take hostages. And they would have definitely succeeded if it weren't for one thing. Mr. Michael stopped by the banquet hall to apologize. He immediately realized that the terrorists' target was not the entire hall, but just a few people, the mayor. The target was clear as day. The mayor and, of course, the people closest to him, i.e., his wife and stepson. Realizing all this, Mr. Michael acted as quickly as he could. He quickly muttered into his radio, informing his subordinates of the incident and dragging Jane and John behind him, sending them out through the service exit, ordering them to run as fast as possible, and of course to call for backup. But there was no way he could leave on his own. He suspected that the terrorists had come solely for the mayor, that is, his ex-wife's new husband, and no matter how he felt about him, he couldn't do otherwise. He returned to the banquet hall quietly, almost imperceptibly. He noticed that the mayor was being closely followed by one of the terrorists. He devised a plan. He burst in unexpectedly, took a few bullets, but luckily he was wearing a bulletproof vest. He grabbed the mayor and quickly, even lightning fast, brought him to the service exit. "Save yourselves," he shouted, forcibly pushing the hostage, "and take care of my wife." Scared half to death, the mayor obeyed and ran down the back stairs to call for help, and Mr. Michael was obliged to return to help the other hostages. But before he could even turn around, he was shot in the neck, falling backwards. Mr. Michael lost track of time. He had basically lost time, place, and the essence of life, and he seemed to be submerged in a deep vat of water. He'd come out of it, and then he'd sink deeper. The first time he opened his eyes, he saw the panic of the medics. Then he saw an illuminated tunnel, and then he saw them. Mr. Michael opened his eyes, barely breathing. Jane and John were leaning over him. The son held his crying mother close to him and was the first to notice that Mr. Michael was awake. "Daddy," he shouted like a boy. "Son." Mr. Michael called out to him with great difficulty. "You forgive me, Dad, live. Dad, I forgive you. Just live." Jane turned to Mr. Michael and gently, so as not to hurt him, pressed him against her. "We forgive you. You saved us. You saved my husband. I'm having trouble breathing. Am I in the hospital?" "Yes, you've lost a lot of blood, but there's a chance," John answered. "There isn't," Mr. Michael said, losing his strength. "Promise me that ... that. We'll do anything." Jane shouted. "Take care of my dog. She's at home, a Labrador, my golden." Of course, Father John couldn't hold back his tears. "I'm proud of you." "Goodbye," Mr. Michael said quietly, and after these words his life was cut short. He died a true hero. Thanks to him, it was possible not only to save many lives, but also to neutralize the terrorists. All those who knew him spoke of him with respect, and although he had once done bad things, he managed to redeem himself. A plaque with his name and surname was hung right in the hotel, dubbing Mr. Michael a hero posthumously. The entire hotel staff attended the funeral, unable to hold back tears. Though most had not got to know him properly during his lifetime, he was missed. Once again, rumors spread around the hotel. This time, however, they were true. No one brought up vampires, maniacs, or even fictional blood rituals. Everyone was discussing the hero. Maybe the stories about him would be told very differently in the distant future. But for now, everyone knew that Mr. Michael was a hero. Mr. Michael's own son had taken custody of the loyal dog. Luckily, John loved dogs. For years, he dreamed of having one of his own, but had been hesitant to buy one. Heaven probably heard him, albeit in such a subtle way. John took the dog for himself and now remembered his father every day. Many people were surprised to learn that in the evenings, frowning Mr. Michael walked a good-natured golden Labrador. The dog was very kind. You could tell he'd been raised by a good man. Jane lived happily as the mayor's wife. Like Mr. Michael's eldest son, she remembered him. But not often, but now only with a kind word. After a year of married life, Jane became pregnant and gave birth to a second son. Her husband had suggested naming him after the man who had saved their lives. Heavy rain pounded on the umbrellas. Despite the mud underfoot, Sven stood still. No one traveled to the cemetery at this hour, but Sven didn't care. He was looking at the grave of Mr. Michael, a man he had never really known. Yet he felt such pride simply for the fact that they had been fortunate enough to know each other. He stared at the gravestone, pondering. He loved coming here to think. It seemed Mr. Michael could hear him, could talk to him. And though Sven realized it was strange, he didn't care. He looked round and said faintly, "Mr. Michael, I should propose to Zoe." "I'm afraid she'll say no," he said. A bright bolt of lightning struck somewhere in the distance, illuminating the dark graveyard for a split second, and Sven smiled broadly, taking it as a sign from Mr. Mike. "Thank you, Mr. Michael," he said. "I'm on my way to buy the ring now." The girl tried to cover her face with her hands. Around her classmates were running around her and pulling her hair. Ugly. Ben Swan shouted at the top of his lungs. "Look at her. Elephant ears." Anne didn't even cry. She was used to being bullied by her classmates. She knew that if she stood still, they would quickly calm down and let her go. That's what happened that time. After about 5 minutes, the excitement disappeared. The girl quickly took her bag and ran towards the house. But when she ran 10 meters, a stone hit her in the back. "Ah," she cried out and turned round. Behind her, Sven was laughing at the top of his lungs. The girl cried. Time passed, and the boy's hatred seemed to fade, but her classmates seemed to go mad. Anne had always had a reputation for being the ugliest girl in the class, and then the real miracles began to happen. She became not just a teenager, but a real beauty. Her gorgeous thick hair covered her big ears, her huge nose seemed to shrink, and Anne's unusually beautiful eyes came to the fore. The girls in her class, sensing great competition, tried their best to uphold a long-standing tradition. What a freak, they whispered behind her. How could the earth be so ugly? By graduation, life had put everything in its place, and the ugly duckling, her beauty, overshadowed all the written beauties of the school. But by the end of her studies, Anne had already formed such a low self-esteem that she could not develop confidence in herself because of her appearance. The girl's parents were ordinary laborers, and they simply had neither the physical strength nor such looks to help their daughter in any way. On the contrary, Anne in their eyes was a girl of modesty, and this was very much appreciated in the society in which they lived. The only thing that saved our heroine was studying. Since she had neither girlfriends nor friends, she devoted all her time to lessons, so that the only student for many years held in her hands a gold medal and dreamed of institute. However, Anne entered the university easily. There were no problems in passing the exams. The examiner even joked at her. I feel that a new luminary of science awaits us, perhaps. He shook the student's hand after the exams were over. And so the small town was left behind. How Anne wished then that her complexes were in the past. But no, she brought them all to the University of Florida, which greatly complicated the girl's life. It's been 17 years. Anne, please look at this document, asked the chief. The woman adjusted her large glasses and began to carefully read every word. What do you think? He exclaimed, folding his arms across his chest. I don't like their condition, she scratched her head. It's a lot to take on. I wouldn't risk it, Anne concluded. Neither would I. We don't know what they'll do with our equipment. Maybe they'll break something on purpose, sighed the director. And I don't like all these non-standard contracts. There are time-tested documents. Why reinvent the wheel? Exactly, because they want to hide something from us, Anne said sadly. Mr. Jason, let's check them out, have another meeting, and then, as they say, either kick them up the arse or hug them. Let's do it. He agreed and walked out of his deputy's office. He kept wiping his sweaty face from the exertion. Anne sighed. She had worked with Mr. Jason for years. She'd come to him from the institute, in fact, and over the years she'd worked hard to grow into a good position. She still had some grasp of other people's psychology, but she had a good grasp of her own. Miami was burning hot. It was the most unbearable heat. Neither fans nor air conditioning could help. Anne put a bottle of ice on her forehead. It always worked for her. Even her head felt like it was going to boil. She sighed, fixed her wedding ring on her finger. Something had to be done. Again, the painful question appeared in her mind. I'm indulging him myself. And what's the result? Anne wondered. What's changed in the last few years? Nothing. How long can you lie on the sofa without working? I don't believe in his illness anymore. Why do others get better, but he doesn't? Anne drove home in a low mood. Every day it seemed to her more and more that her marriage had been a mistake. As soon as the girl began her university studies, her life changed dramatically. Anne's parents did not have so much money to rent her a separate accommodation, so she, like many other students, was lucky she was given a place in the dormitory. But for Anne, it was a real stress. The reserved girl found herself in a room with two other, more open and cheerful students. Friendship between them did not develop, but they lived, in general, not bad. Almost the whole first year, Anne suffered from insomnia. She'd never lived so close to anyone before. And she had her own room at home, and here she was sharing her life with strangers. But her passion for her studies overcame the awkwardness, and Anne concentrated on her studies. In her 5th year, Anne was hired by an industrial equipment company. Before enrolling, Anne never had any doubts that she needed to graduate in engineering. The girl saw great prospects in this field, so from the very first day of her work experience, Anne began to work hard for a better future. And in 3 years, she had already become a leading employee. She was able to take out a flat on credit. It seemed that life had improved. The salary was good. Every now and then she was praised by the general manager. And in 2 years, a new miracle happened. For health reasons, the last director left and strongly recommended to appoint Anne as a director. So, in her almost 30s, Anne was already working as a general manager, and for the next couple of years, she was able to pay off her loan in full and buy herself a car. When she first came to work, the company was headed by Mr. Jason's father, but he soon died suddenly, and the young man took all the responsibility on himself. At first, all the employees were afraid that he would fail. But no, the young man proved to be quite resilient and competent to take his father's company to the next level. I wish it would rain. Anne walked out of the office building. I can't take it anymore. She was originally from the South herself, but the localized climate at Miami had made the city unbearable in the summer. Truth be told, despite the proximity of the ocean, they didn't get out to it that often on weekends. Usually Anne would pick up some paperwork and do something at home. I don't want anything the woman exhaled, but she was well aware that she still had to stop at the shop. Michael hadn't been out of bed for the last month. At first Anne was very worried about her husband, but then she began to notice the blush on his face. She had various thoughts in her head, but being busy at work and her mother-in-law, although not often, but interfered in their lives. Anne felt as if she were in charge of her husband. Michael was more like her appendage than a separate being. The lack of friends also made things much worse. Anne didn't really have anyone to talk to. Her parents weren't really interested in her affairs. She helped them buy a nice house, so they just lived their lives, and Anne seemed to have everything. She eventually sold her one-bedroom flat, and just before she met Michael, decided to invest the money and bought a 2-bedroom flat. But here is a family happiness to her never came, although everything started so beautifully. In his 32, Anne finally met him. Or rather, Michael himself approached her. Anne had seen him a couple of times at work. He was the office supplies manager. Michael read the sign that said this office was the office of the chief engineer. Knocking, he was invited in by Mrs. Anne. A Hollywood smile flooded the guest's face. "I'm here to see you. Last time you ordered something, but we didn't have that model then. Can I offer you something in return?" Quickly, he took a huge catalog out of the bag and began to leaf through it. Anne was concentrating on her work and couldn't understand what he wanted from her. "What do you think of this shelving unit?" Michael poked his finger and chose the more expensive options. "It will look great in your interior." The guest was so confused that the general manager poked at the first option and closed the catalog. "A very good choice," Michael said with a smile. "By the way," he glanced at the woman's hands, "I hope you won't mind if I send you a present from me personally." No, Anne didn't take his words to heart. She stared at her papers again. The working day was almost over when there was another knock on Anne's door. She asked to come in. A courier stood in front of her, holding a gorgeous bouquet. She looked at him in bewilderment. "These are for you." The man handed her the flowers. "Please sign." There was a note in the bouquet to the most beautiful woman in the world, she read. "I can't make any sense of it. Maybe someone mixed it up." But the piece of paper definitely had an address and her last name on it. She set the flowers down and concentrated on her work again. Several times she lifted her glasses and wondered who it could be. Anne didn't take the roses home. She safely forgot about them as soon as she grabbed her coat. 3 days later, Michael reappeared in the office. He brought the ordered furniture. He went to see the general manager again. "I hope you like the flowers," he said shyly. "I really wanted to make you happy." "Oh, it was you?" Surprised woman. "Thank you, yes. The flowers were excellent." And yet the next day Anne remembered the flowers and took the roses home. "I realize this may seem indecent of me," the man blushed. "But I'd really like to invite you to dinner," Michael said. Anne blushed too. "I don't even know," she replied simply. "I have so much work to do." "But you can do it once." He pressed her a little. "Please, just one evening." And Anne agreed. Of course, she often traveled to business meetings, restaurants, and clients, but she still had no personal life. In principle, the woman had made her peace with that, and Michael was charming. Every now and then he praised Anne and everything she did. The compliments poured in, making the woman feel uncomfortable. Something in her heart twitched. A strong desire to have a family and indeed to love and be loved by someone rose to the surface. Her beloved man looked after her in such a way that it seemed that there was no better man in the whole world. Romance, live concerts, long walks. Anne had given up. For the first time in her life, she let go of her inner tension and fell in love. It's safe to say she was happy then. "Marry me," Michael asked her one day. "Anne, I love you. You're my woman." After this proposal was immediately met with the man's mother. She turned out to be a real angel. Mrs. Caroline kept echoing her son's sentiments. How extraordinary Anne is. The lack of experience of close contact with people did its job, and Anne completely trusted her fiancé and his mother. The wedding was not too pompous, although there were plenty of guests present, and somehow it happened from the beginning that Michael moved into his wife's flat. They wouldn't have been able to live at his mother's place in a one-bedroom anyway. And it all seemed so logical. That's how the family life of our heroine began. It should be emphasized once again that the lack of serious relationships Anne with the opposite sex drew in her imagination great love, for which she was ready to go to the edge of the world. Not immediately, but the woman began to notice that her husband is somehow not quite like the one she imagined. A year after the wedding, Michael quit his job. Then he spent almost a year interviewing for a job, but he never found a decent position. "Michael, well, you have a good experience of working with people," his wife Anne advised him. "Just start small. I'm sure in a couple of months you'll be noticed and promoted." "I'm sick and tired of being on the dole," he said angrily. "I can't understand what they want from me. But how can they offer me 30 to 40,000 with my skills? You're being paid 150. "Michael," Anne said, "but I'm deputy director now. I have so much responsibility that I'm in charge of all the processes in our company." "And you think I had no responsibility in my office? My husband wouldn't give up. No, I've had enough. Either let them pay me at least 60 to 70, or..." He stopped talking. "But not every company will pay a deputy like me 155. I know small offices where the deputy director gets 50. It depends on the size of the company." As much as Anne wanted to help Michael, she couldn't. She had no idea that her husband's arrogance had not come from nothing. "Son, you're so lucky to have her." My darling Mrs. Caroline nodded. "Where else would she find such a man? You don't drink, you don't smoke, you don't look at other women. You've got to fulfill yourself, haven't you? While you're looking for a decent job, let Anne support you. It's normal," she stressed the last word, "if she's so lucky in life. Though who knows how she got to be the deputy," she said quietly, so that her son wouldn't hear her. Mrs. Caroline did not stoop to primitive insults, but she always spoke plainly. So from the outside, she looked like a woman of wisdom who should have listened. Michael, you could say, was a fan of his mother. If he had been asked to name a woman who embodied the feminine ideal, he would have called her name without hesitation. "I feel bad for Anne sometimes," Michael admitted honestly. "After all, she does work weekends." "Michael, times have changed," Mrs. Caroline replied. "Who says a man has to support a woman?" She raised an eyebrow. "And there's no telling what kind of job you'll get. Let's say you're offered a deputy or even a director's position. You have experience, and you know how to communicate with people. And then what do you get? If you get a higher salary, Anne has to feel uncomfortable. That's not the way it works." His mother's argument seemed reasonable to him. In fact, she was the one who had steered his son in the right direction, so to speak. When Michael told her that he liked a woman who was doing well in life, Mrs. Caroline, in her manner, as if by accident, advised him to look at this Anne. Mrs. Caroline was well aware of her son's worthlessness. She was determined to do everything she could to marry him to Anne. She had a 3-room flat and a huge salary by her standards. Who would want her inactive son? No matter how hard Michael's mother tried, he grew up as an uninitiative guy. He struggled to graduate from college. Twice Mrs. Caroline almost married him off, of course, to girls with a better position. But nobody wanted to look at Michael. So it was his mother, not he, who was behind all the courtship of Anne. She outlined the program point by point, how he should behave, what to talk about, how to dress. From Michael's descriptions, his mother quickly realized that Anne was a common gray mouse, so she had no doubt that she could easily handle her. Somehow, Mrs. Caroline insisted that Michael keep his job for another year. They were going to sack him for irresponsibility, but the woman talked to the director and cried that they needed money for medication. In general, with a bit of grief, Michael was left for another year. At the beginning of the 3rd year of married life, in order not to inflame the situation, he finally accepted the offer of One Enterprise. And Anne was happy in a way, too. "My son is a businessman," Mrs. Caroline said proudly. "He opened a huge bakery, and for the first 6 months everything seemed to be going well. But then, in a flash." "What happened?" Anne ran up to Michael. "When he came home late one night, they made me sign the papers," he said through tears. In her husband's version, the competitors hired thugs and took the bakery away from him. In reality, of course, it was the other way round. Michael, as they say, failed in his elementary duties. In his life, he never had assistants who would knead dough and bake pies for free. Because of his laziness and slackness, he blew it all. 2 weeks after this terrible event, Michael became seriously ill. Again, on his mother's advice. Anne's mind was reeling. Not only had she lost the money she had worked so hard to earn, but now her husband was ill with some rare, incurable disease. "Anne, don't worry," Michael groaned. "Mum will take care of me." Secretly from Anne, Michael wrote a power of attorney for his car, which, incidentally, also bought him a wife. And it wasn't cheap, so now there was an excuse to make it look like Mrs. Caroline had to take care of her son. As far as Anne knew, she was working, but according to her mother-in-law, they let her go when she needed to. Anne was under stress. Her hands shook as she read the doctor's report. "What does it mean?" she asked her mother-in-law. "Is it treatable? Should we go to New York or Los Angeles?" There's no point," Mrs. Caroline sighed. "Anne, he needs a rest. He's exhausted himself because of this business of his." She wept. "My boy has worked so hard for you." Anne felt a hidden reproach. The wife certainly felt some resentment towards Michael, just throwing away $1 million, but now she was ashamed of it. "Don't worry, I'll take care of his treatment myself," said the mother-in-law. "Only the doctor prescribed expensive medication," mother-in-law said carefully. "I'll transfer the money to Michael's card. You can spend as much as you need." "Thank you, darling," Mrs. Caroline hugged her and sobbed. "I have a golden daughter-in-law. How lucky my son is. I'm so grateful to you for not abandoning Michael in his hour of need." To be honest, Mrs. Caroline had been frightened out of her wits when her worthless Michael had lost his pie shop. The woman realized that if some tragic event wasn't introduced now, she might drop him. And to lose such a feeding ground would be a complete folly for both of them. So Michael developed a rare autoimmune disease, naturally incurable. "Mum, I can't stay in bed all the time." Michael sighed. "Are you having a crisis?" she said. "When you go into remission, you'll feel better. So there will be times when you'll be lying down, but most of the time you'll be able to drive your car, go for walks. Are you sick? Be thankful you have such a wonderful wife." Anne did go to the doctor who supposedly treated her husband. He confirmed the diagnosis on the certificate. It didn't even occur to the woman that he'd just been paid off. If she had made Michael retake the tests with another doctor, then everything would have been clarified. But she was used to trusting her husband. And she would never have thought of such perfidy. Anne was secretive, but she was generally good with people. Anne got out of the car and headed for her driveway. She stopped at the shop and bought 2 bags of groceries. It was mostly ready-to-eat or convenience foods. Because of her stressful job, Anne was woefully short of time to do household chores. Mr. Jason had made her not just a deputy, but an assistant, a consultant, and a friend in one person. This, of course, put additional responsibilities on the woman, but basically the chief was the only person she could be friends with. There were never any games or lies between them. They both told each other the truth. She was very comfortable in Mr. Jason's company. In short, she would not hesitate to go on a scouting mission with him, if it was offered to her. She opened the door to the flat and immediately heard a groan. She so wished she could have stayed in silence, but her husband's illness was adding to her already frayed nerves. "Hi," she smiled, staring intently into Michael's face. For almost a week, she couldn't control herself. Whenever she saw her husband, for some reason she paid attention to the color of his skin. To her surprise, his skin was pink and looked like a normal, healthy person. "How are you feeling?" she asked the traditional question. "Are you hungry?" "No, my mum left a while ago. She fed me," her husband said faintly. "She went to the doctor. He said that in a week or so I should feel better and I should be able to go out." "All right," she smiled wryly. "Then I'll go to work. I have to." "I guess it's my fault," Anne thought, chewing on a cutlet. "I wanted a family so badly, but I didn't realize it wasn't just for one night. I have a job. I can't devote as much time to Michael as he wants. Otherwise, who would work?" Lately, Anne had even started watching programs. She wanted to know how other spouses lived, what they did. "I feel like there's something wrong with me," Anne sighed. "Maybe family is just not my thing. There are women who stay alone for the rest of their lives." Anne had never thought about children. Or rather, she was insanely afraid of this question. "Maybe I should see a psychologist?" A thought flashed through her head. "I won't be able to do that for so long." She covered her face with her hands, tears welling up involuntarily. She rarely felt sorry for herself. She was used to suppressing negative feelings or forbidding herself from feeling them. The next day, during her lunch break, the woman made an appointment with a specialist. End of the working day. Anne was looking forward to it on the one hand, but on the other she was apprehensive. She took a deep breath, knocked on the door, and was invited in. In front of her was a man in his 50s. He smiled radiantly. Anne was touched by the fact that his smile was genuine. She could feel it. "I wish I could swim in the sea right now. I can feel with my skin how cool the water is," said the psychologist cheerfully. "I am so attracted to the open space. I like the forest more." Anne joined the conversation. "There you can hide from prying eyes." "Do you think someone is following you?" The man asked a provocative question. "Sometimes I do," she admitted honestly. "I feel that I always have to be on guard. It's the only way I can be safe." "And how would you describe this danger?" he asked cautiously. "You could use adjectives like slippery, cold, terrifying." The guest hesitated. She had never gone so deep inside herself, and immediately she felt fear. "I would say danger is someplace where I feel bad, where I feel intense fear." "Is that where something is going to happen to you?" The psychologist asked a leading question. "Can you visualize this event?" "I just feel that something could happen, and I would suffer a lot," she sighed. "Are you happy now?" The man asked the unexpected question. "Just the very fact that I have you says that you are not. You are already suffering." Anne's lips quivered and tears flowed from her eyes. The psychologist waited silently for her to release her emotions. "I feel a constant inner tension. It's wearing me out," she whispered. "My husband is seriously ill and I don't know what to do about it." "Are you worried that your husband will die?" the man asked. "Do you feel that you are responsible for his life?" No, the patient shook her head negatively. "What's the right way to put it?" Anne wondered. "I'm afraid of being bad. Sometimes I think I can't stand it and imagine leaving my husband. I feel so ashamed." "Why do you think that if you don't have the strength to look after him, you must be bad? And anyway, who determines whether a person is bad or good?" "But it is understandable, the people around us," said the woman. And she was struck by the answer. "God, it turns out that I am with my husband not because I love him, but because I want to be good in other people's eyes." "In whose eyes exactly?" The psychologist kept his eyes on her. "Can you name specific people?" "Yes, my parents, my husband's mother, he himself," she looked at the man pleadingly. "Especially the last two." "Would you say that your husband and his mother define what you should be?" The psychologist concluded. "Do you understand?" Anne clenched her fingers nervously. "As a child, I was constantly laughed at by my classmates, and I didn't think I could ever get married. I never had any friends." Tears came out of her eyes again. "So you're saying that because your husband paid attention to you, you're willing to serve him. You were bad in your own eyes. How else do you explain being laughed at?" He hurt her feelings. And when someone paid attention to you, were you willing to be anything to avoid feeling humiliated and guilty again? Anne took a break. Went outside. Her hands were shaking. She couldn't seem to hide anything from the psychologist. He could see right through her. 10 minutes later, Anne came back. I've decided that I'd rather be hurt now, but I'd rather be free of this burden once and for all, she said. Anne, why were you bullied by your classmates? The doctor suddenly plunged a knife into her heart. I was ugly as a child, she sobbed. That's why everyone laughed at me. Which girl in your class was the prettiest, please? The man kept his eyes on her. I don't know, she answered timidly. I never thought about it. I thought many of my classmates looked like me. Catherine had ears as big as mine. Elizabeth was very thin. If I told you now that you were no different from any other girl, how would you feel now? Mr. Jason asked. As if there had never been all that mockery of me, Anne answered suddenly. It was just a dream. Exactly. You were never an ugly girl. Can you understand that? Ugliness is so rare. What is it when a child has 11 fingers instead of 10, or one body and two heads like Siamese twins? Everything else is normal. Think of your worst abuser. And now from your current level, tell me, was he or she beautiful? No. Anne immediately thought of Ben Swan, the bully in her class. He even had a nasty look on his face. After the first session, Anne had a real revolution. It was funny to her how she could react to her classmates like that, because it was her reaction that determined everything. If she, as a child, had not believed that she was ugly, they would have all quickly moved away from her. With Michael, the situation was similar. It was just that now she was on the opposite side. After all, he had convinced her that she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Naturally, it was more pleasant to be on this side than as a child, with constant humiliation. Neither of these things will make me happy, Anne whispered as she stopped the car outside the house. I just agreed to marry Michael because he covered my complexes, and I was willing to pay for it. God. I was willing to pay for being treated well and loved. The woman was so scared of feeling powerless again, like when she was a child. So she saw Michael as a guarantee that it would never happen to her again. And if there's a demand, there's always a supply. Nothing new. Anne's request had been heard, and Michael was exactly what she needed. The truth caused a lot of pain, but the woman decided she'd had enough. She was tired of playing the role of the perfect wife. Besides, she felt that everything in her life was one-sided. Anyone would have noticed that from the outside. She walked resolutely into the flat. She decided to distance herself from her husband's illness and be more cold-blooded about the whole situation. Anne, you've come already, said Miss Caroline. Mom said I need to pay the insurance for my car. The wife was silent. Michael looked at her in bewilderment. Anne? He looked into her face and said. Anne was glowing. Since Mrs. Caroline is driving it now, I think she can pay for it, she said calmly. Her husband almost jumped out of bed. Anne noticed the impulse. There was a look of bewilderment in his eyes. I'm already spending almost all the money on your treatment, Anne exclaimed. Let your mother do something to help, she said calmly. The man was not prepared for such a development. He didn't even know what to say to her. I will continue my work with the psychologist, Anne said to herself. Stop writing me. I've never been in anyone's debt. There's nothing wrong with me. And Michael lay there in pain. He'd promised his mother he'd wire her the insurance money tonight. The money Anne had sent for his medication, his mother had already withdrawn and hidden. Michael, what's up? She called him tomorrow morning. I need to drop off the paperwork. Mum, she won't give me the insurance money, her son whispered quietly to her. What Mrs. Caroline snapped out of her role. Is she out of her mind? The mother-in-law was outraged. Oh, I didn't like my daughter-in-law's answer. All these years I've been courting her, and now this. Well, I'll arrange for you. She was angry. If you don't want to be nice, I'll take more money from you. Naturally, Mrs. Caroline could do nothing. She just polluted the air with her profanity. But somehow the woman was sure that she would find a way out of Anne. At the second session, Anne realized even more that something was wrong in her relationship with her husband. "Why don't you have children?" The psychologist asked the question head-on. It's fear, he glared at the patient. "Yes," she said confidently. "I'm afraid that I won't be able to cope with motherhood and that I'll be judged." "Anne, you have to look at your motivation, that is, what has driven you so far," the doctor said seriously. "It hurts me to be humiliated," she replied immediately. "So you've been driven by fear?" "Yes. But that's not all." Anne reflected. She looked at her life, but could only find a constant struggle for her psychological comfort. "The second is much harder to see." The psychologist understood her confusion. "Your second motivation was to do anything to avoid being yourself." He drew a stunning conclusion. "After all, from your childhood experience, it turned out that if you are as you are, then you will surely be punished for it. And since you couldn't change the shape of your ears or shorten your nose, it seemed that you were doomed to humiliation. Being yourself was bad, it was dangerous." Something came up to Anne's throat and she cried. The psychologist had made it clear to her that this was so. The woman had always been afraid of herself. It seemed to her that the true Anne was somehow unseemly. She didn't live up to the standards set. And if she became herself again, she would suffer so much that she might die of pain. That's a lie. The psychologist brought her back to reality. Only when you are yourself will you find true happiness. It is all these imposed roles that create suffering in your life. You must have the courage to look at the Anne you have inside you. There is no other way. Perhaps Anne could have said it was the most important day of her life. But there was a real revolution in her mind from the mere idea that she wasn't real now. Her fear receded. So Anne decided, no matter what, to only move forward. On the way home, a strange thought popped into her head. She turned the car around and drove towards a medical center. Anne had been there a couple of times before. "Would you go tomorrow at 11 o'clock? The nurse asked her. "We will come with the doctor because we have to take blood for a test." Why Anne had decided not to warn Michael, she didn't know. It was just her intuition that told her to do it that way. "I don't want him to get nervous early," the woman made up a reason for herself. She was a little embarrassed that her husband wasn't talking to her. Perhaps earlier she would have liked to know why, but then she somehow just took it all in stride. The next morning she went into the chief's office to excuse herself for an hour. Mr. Jason was sitting there with a sad face. "Did something happen to you?" she asked fearfully. "Are you pale? Do you have blood pressure?" "No," he sighed. "It's just a family emergency, but it'll pass." He tried to smile. Mr. Jason was going to celebrate his 45th birthday this year, but things hadn't worked out. The children had grown up and moved into their own flat, bought by their father. And with his wife, they lived like strangers. "I'm tired," Mr. Jason admitted. "You know, sometimes I think about selling the business. I can't take it anymore." "I understand." The woman sat down on the table. "You and I are like two squirrels in a wheel. We're going to get kicked out of it someday. The only question is whether we'll be alive afterwards." "I don't know," he said seriously. "Anne, why do I need all this? I've got everything I need. I want a peaceful old age." "You are still young," smiled the assistant. "The midlife crisis ages us all. You and I live in such a beautiful place, but we don't have time to go to the ocean," he sighed. "Mr. Jason, I need an hour with my husband." "The doctor has to be here," Anne asked. The man waved his hand. He trusted his deputy like he trusted himself. He'd never had a problem with Anne. "Is there any point in trying to keep the family together if I discussed her?" Mr. Jason reasoned. Lucy had already fulfilled her every whim, and now she was no longer interested in me. His wife's coldness had become annoying of late. People always think that lack of money is the only problem for scandals in a family. But Mr. Jason could say with complete certainty that it didn't make any difference. You can be loved for money. But when you get so much of it that a person stops hiding their sincere intentions from you, that's the end of it. Lucy, Mr. Jason's wife, was no longer afraid of losing him. It seemed to him that she was even deliberately doing everything she could to make him the first to offer her a divorce. That way the woman could get a great deal of money. And considering the fact that Lucy had never worked, it still wasn't fair in her husband's eyes. Of course he wasn't going to leave her penniless, but to give away half of the business, just like that, was a real sacrilege. All right, he sighed. As long as it lasted, as long as it lasted. We'll see about that. Anne glanced nervously at her watch. She was due home at 10:45. Mrs. Caroline, according to Michael, usually visited him at an hour or two when she brought him a fresh lunch. She opened the flat door, entered quietly, peered into her husband's room and froze. The bed was empty. Anne went through all the rooms, but Michael wasn't home. So Anne decided to call him. Michael, hello, she took an air and tried to say each word calmly. How are you? What are you doing? Hi, he said quietly. Anne, what can I do? I've been lying around all day. I can't even get to the loo. Mom should be here soon. There was a click, and the door opened. My husband Michael appeared in the corridor. He almost fell through the floor when he saw Anne. I went to the drugstore. I didn't want to upset you, he mumbled in his defense. I could barely make it back. Get down. The wife ordered him to lie down. The doctor is coming to examine you. Why? Michael asked Anne a strange question. The doctor just came the other day. Well, as they say, trust but verify, she said angrily. Come on, they'll be here in a minute. I'm not going to see another doctor. Michael got angry and sat down on the couch. If you don't trust me, say so. He began to use a clever trick. That's it. Anne screamed. Her husband has never seen her so angry. Do you think you found a fool? That's it, I've had enough. Or you stop this comedy. She rushed into the corridor and ran out of the flat. Oh shit, Michael cursed at himself. Why did I go to the shop, you idiot? What's going to happen now? He dialed his mother's number. Anne drove to work and sobbed. She hated everyone, especially herself. She had to be so stupid. Divorce him, she said to herself. Let the dependent get out of my flat. A bloody Alfonso. That's it, I've had enough. She closed herself in her office and there was a knock. She didn't open the door right away. The chief came in. Anne, what are you doing? He was frightened. Anne. He ran for cold water. Mr. Jason, how can you be such an idiot? She stammered. He played a trick on me. He was never sick, do you understand? He just didn't want to work, and he thought I'd just keep feeding him. So the man scratched his head. This is all very familiar to me. Get your things, he ordered and grabbed her arm. Mr. Jason deftly fitted himself into the rows of cars. 40 minutes later, they pulled onto the open motorway. On the way, the chief stopped to buy cold water and something to eat. The two of them sat on a deserted beach. Mr. Jason knew a couple of good places like that, silent and staring off into the distance. You could tell that both the man and the woman were experiencing the same thing. I told her first, the chief turned to Anne. I can't take it anymore. I come home and she turns her nose up at me. I'm sick of it. At first I was ashamed in front of the kids, but they're grown up and have their own lives. I'm going to file for divorce too. Mr. Jason, how could you use me like that? The assistant whispered. I'm not made of iron. Somehow he's convinced he's the only one who needs me. What's wrong with me? She looked at the man. Anne, yes, all this is nonsense, he smiled. This I say to you as a representative of the stronger sex. As for me, you should be chased by a crowd of men. Do you want me to prove it to you tonight? You'll be fighting off your admirers. You owe me a nice dress and loose hair. Where are we going? She asked Jason hesitantly. I don't know, Anne. But you've known me for days, he stroked her head. How could I get you into anything bad? No, she shook her head negatively. All right then, I accept your challenge. She rose to her feet. Stop being a whiner. If I want to be happy, I have to do it myself. It was about 7 o'clock. When they got back to the office, she got into her car. They'd arranged for Mr. Jason to pick her up at 9. She didn't even pay any attention to her husband. Quickly she went into her room, locked herself in, pulled out her prettiest dress, put on her eyelashes, unraveled her ponytail. She heard her mother-in-law's voice behind her back. "We need to talk," she said in a commanding voice. Anne said nothing to her and left the flat. Mrs. Caroline stared at her in bewilderment. "Where is she going?" The mother asked her son Michael, who came up to her. "I don't understand." Meanwhile, Anne jumped into the car with the chief. He smiled. "Let's go, shall we?" He laughed. "I hope you're not going to leave me, Mr. Jason. What if someone comes on to me?" The woman was afraid. "You're not alone. Your beau will be sitting nearby." He pointed his finger at himself. Anne laughed merrily. She had seldom experienced such a state of lightness and joy. "Well then, let's get on with the adventure." The passenger commanded, and the car started. They stopped outside a decent club. Mr. Jason knew that it was a respectable men's club, so it wasn't the sort of place where fighting or brawling was part of the program. "Come out," he said, giving his lady a hand. "You had a husband, and now you are completely free. So put a smile on your face." It was Anne's first time in a place like this. She raised her head high and seemed to swim to the table. Mr. Jason deliberately sat down at another. No sooner had Anne looked at the menu than a waiter approached her. He was holding a bottle of wine. "This is for you from that gentleman over there." The guy gently showed his hand, along with wishes for a good evening. Anne, like a lady of the world, inclined her head in agreement, turned round and looked at the chief. He was smiling at her with his arms crossed over his chest. Mr. Jason was absolutely right. About 10 people had met her today. "You are simply irresistible," an older man said to her. "Shall we play roulette? A lady like that must love gambling." "Unfortunately, I am an exception to the rule," she smiled. "Besides, my man should be here soon." All in all, in an hour Anne was even tired. She was not used to such attention from men. The chief noticed her uneasiness and sat down beside her. "I counted 11, he said cheerfully. "Well, shall we dance now?" He held out his hand to her. Anne was afraid to tell him that she had never danced in her life. But Mr. Jason quickly put his arm round her waist and led the way. "Mr. Jason, you've opened up a whole new world for me." She couldn't catch her breath when they returned to the table. "But this place is more for flings," he admitted. "But that doesn't change anything." "Oh, you." Anne wanted to tell him, but she laughed out loud. "That's why they come to me so easily." "But I couldn't tell you that," said the chief seriously. "Otherwise you would never have agreed." The night brought a little chill, and the colleagues walked along the deserted street. "I love it when the crickets sing," Mr. Jason said. "You know, it's been a long time since I've had a rest. Thank you, Lord. It's like I've lost 10 years, he said. "You know, I don't want to lie. I don't want to go home," she said. "My husband is the past of my life." "I feel the same way now. Anne, we have to move on," he stopped in front of her. "Our fixation on all these standards. Oh my God. It's like I've just woken up from a long sleep," Anne whispered. "What have I done to myself? I've hated myself all this time." It was about 3 o'clock when Mr. Jason stopped the car outside her house. They were silent for a while. Neither of them wanted to break the magic silence. "See you tonight," he said quietly. "Until today," she repeated. The principal watched her swim towards the driveway. Anne's luxurious hair fluttered in the wind. "A stunning woman," he sighed. "Why hadn't we met before?" Michael sat in the corridor, leaning against the wall, asleep. He never waited for his wife to return. She hadn't returned his calls. Anne shamelessly stepped over him and locked herself in her room. She didn't care. The divorce issue had been settled. Now it was only a matter of time for Anne. She had no interest in Michael and what would happen to him now. She got up early on purpose. It wasn't even 7 o'clock. Anne dressed quickly. She didn't want to see her husband. He was still lying in the corridor. He opened his eyes abruptly, rushed to his wife's room, but it was closed. Did she not sleep at home tonight? He thought in horror. God, what's happening to her? He rang his mother, who promised to come soon. Mrs. Caroline was very nervous about her daughter-in-law. She really didn't like the whole story. God forbid she should find someone else, she said, pacing up and down the room. Michael, how could you do this to me? I told you to lie down. You should be up and about by next week. She won't even talk to me, the son said through his tears. So is Mum going to be with me now? If she... There will be no divorce, she threw angrily at him. Nobody needs your Anne but you. Maybe she just couldn't take it, found herself a man for the evening. No one's going to have a serious relationship with her. Have you seen the glasses she wears? She's a skank, for God's sake. How can you even sleep in the same bed with her? Mrs. Caroline was deliberately exaggerating Anne's shortcomings. She didn't know that last night her daughter-in-law had shown her beauty to the full. And if only she'd given a reason, someone would have hit on her. Mum, talk to her, Michael begged. I can't do this without her. I love her. Tell her you love her money, she said angrily. All right, I'll stay with you tonight. Otherwise, I won't catch her. Anne was almost asleep by her computer when the chief came in and put a mug of strong coffee in front of her. How are you? He asked her thoughtfully. Anne, I was up almost all night, as if in some kind of euphoria. But I can't open my eyes now, Mr. Jason smiled. I'm starving, she whispered, resting her head on the table. Come on, get up, said the headmaster. Let's go to lunch. I'm starving myself. They dragged themselves to the car. She thought she fell asleep on the way. Mr. Jason ordered some interesting juice, and they felt energized immediately afterwards. That's it. The man wiped his flushed face. Can you feel the blood rushing through your body? He asked Anne. What is it made of? She asked. There are some berries in it, but the main ingredient is natural pomegranate juice. The additives are up to you, said Mr. Jason. He looked at Anne with undisguised curiosity. And the day came to an end. Mr. Jason was returning home with a strange feeling. He had already gone up to the first floor when he clearly felt that the time had come. Lucy, he knocked on the door of his wife's room. Can we talk to you? About what? She said nonchalantly, not leaving the room. That gave Mr. Jason even more confidence in his next move. About us, he said coldly. Come out, please. This is serious. Lucy deliberately delayed her exit. Finally, the door opened, and she cast a disgruntled glance at her husband. Lucy, let's not lie to ourselves, he said simply. We don't love each other and haven't for a long time. So what do you suggest? Carelessly threw the wife. Don't spoil my mood for the night. Divorce, he replied seriously. Lucy, I don't see the point of our relationship anymore. The woman shuddered at first, then quickly pulled herself together and paused. All right, Lucy finally replied, if that's what you decide. She wanted to make him feel guilty. Yes, I have made up my mind, Mr. Jason said firmly. And if you don't mind, then you've made up your mind too. The wife didn't want to show her weakness. She would have liked the abandoned woman option, so she could vilify her husband later. Mr. Jason understood that. In recent years, he had unraveled Lucy's true nature to the point where nothing could surprise him. I'll talk to the children myself, he suggested. He hesitated about the property. I agree that you should take your half. Lucy was very happy with that. But Mr. Jason was no fool. He'd been in business too long. His wife was already planning how she would take over his business, but she was in for some unpleasant news. But the time had come. He dialed someone's number. Hi, Brad. Have you changed your mind about buying my company yet? He said. Anne was in no mood to go home. She was desperate for sleep. She entered the flat. Good evening, her mother-in-law said with a certain intonation. Anne, could we talk to you for a moment? Anne nodded. She wanted to put an end to the whole story. Everyone sat down at the kitchen table. Well, I guess I'll start, said Mrs. Caroline. Anne, her tone softened. We were afraid to tell you, so as not to spook your luck. Anyway, a week ago Michael's doctor informed me that he was much better. He also sternly instructed me that Michael should not take any risks for the time being. With his illness, deterioration can occur very quickly. But Michael was so tired of his illness that he told no one that day and went outside. I see, Anne replied calmly. Mrs. Caroline, I beg you, please help Michael to pack his things. Mother and son looked at each other. They couldn't understand what was going on in this situation. It would be better for him to stay with you. Calmly answered her daughter-in-law to her bewilderment. Michael will recover much faster with you. But she didn't know what to say. Anne, this is his home. Besides, I work too, said Mrs. Caroline. That's all right. As they say, home will help, Miss Anne smiled. And as for this being Michael's house, I'm sorry to disappoint you. This is my flat, and your son will no longer be living there. Anne, what are you doing? My husband turned pale. We're family. I love you. Well, I doubt that very much. Anne got up from the table. All right, guests. I'll give you half an hour, take everything you need, and the rest you can pick up later. I'm sorry, I'm very tired today. Michael wanted to make a scene, but his mother signaled him with her hand. She realized that if he overplayed his hand now, they'd never get her back. And it was foolish to lose such a tidbit. Anne had already drifted off to sleep when she heard it. We're going. She didn't say anything, only heard the lock click and rolled over onto her other side. Mom, she's crazy. Michael couldn't calm down. That idiot kicked us out. Yeah, I'm not even going to look at her after that. Michael, calm down, said his mother. If she won't change her mind, then you'll have to make sure you get half the property. Don't be silly. No arguments. Do you understand me? I understand. He sat down tiredly on the bed in his old room. Why did I have to go to that damn shop? He lamented. Everything would be back to normal now. But Michael didn't realize that if it hadn't been for this incident, another one would have happened. Anne was just ripe for another life. They would have broken up anyway. And if he looked honestly, Michael initially had nothing to gain by the breakup of his and Anne's relationship. The next morning, Anne wasn't embarrassed by her husband's absence. She even felt like she should be. Happy, she went to work, dropped her bag, knocked on the door to the boss. Mr. Jason, thank you. You have helped me change my life. She said happily, that's it. I'm divorcing Michael. I don't want to do this anymore. Anne, I've got news for you too, the boss told her with a serious face. I sold the company, so you will have a new boss. Anne immediately covered her face with her hands and cried. How can I be without you? Jason tried to comfort her, but she continued to cry. No amount of coaxing worked. Let's go out tonight, Jason suggested. We could sit somewhere together, okay? He stared into her eyes. Yes, she said, and sobbed again. It'll be okay. I promise. He put his arms around her and pulled her close. We'll have a serious talk tonight. The work wasn't going well. Anne looked at her watch every now and then. She had lost all interest in what she was doing. The director was not only her boss but also her friend, and it was not easy for her to be so close to another person. She was almost pulling up to the house when Michael called. Anne deliberately didn't pick up the phone. Yes, idiots, she cursed. I don't need you. What, you lost your feeder? Now you're just going to have to bite your elbows. Anne had no doubt that Michael was acting under the careful guidance of his mother, Mrs. Caroline. If he wanted his things, he'd find them himself, she decided, so she didn't stay home too long. Anne stood outside the restaurant to which Mr. Jason had invited her. With over an hour to go before the meeting, she just closed her eyes and dreamed. I want a baby, Anne whispered. God, why did I ever want Michael? I never loved him. He was like a leech on me, although now I realize why. The phone rang. It was the chief. He wanted to tell her he'd be here early. I'm already here, Anne laughed. I'm sitting in the car waiting for you. Where are you? She stepped out of the driver's door. Jason was standing by the door. He was holding a gorgeous bouquet. Anne blushed. "These are for you." He handed her the flowers. "Are you ready to have a good time tonight?" You bet she smiled. "Jason, I'll go to the end of the world with you." The man took her by the waist, and they walked in. He had a lot to tell his deputy today. "Anne, I'm divorcing my wife," he began. "To be fair, I sold my company to a good man, but not for the amount of money that's in the contract. Don't worry, there's nothing criminal about it. It's just that my wife is a bit of an arsehole. I'm sorry, but I don't want to go along with her. So I gave her half, or rather a third, of what I got for the firm. I'm not giving her the house either. Of course, she doesn't want to leave it, so she'll have to pay me my half. Don't worry. What she made in the divorce will last her till she's old enough, unless she spends $1 million a month." "What are you going to do now?" Miss Anne asked with interest. "You're a real professional." "But professionals retire, too," he laughed. "Anne, I want a normal life. I need someone who understands me, a reliable friend." The man kept his eyes on her. Anne realized that he was referring to her. Inside her, it was like butterflies were flying. Anne lowered her eyes, her breathing could be heard. She drank some juice as her throat was dry. "Anne, I don't want to play. I like you." Took her hand in his. "In fact, I think we're made for each other." How Anne at that moment wished she could go back to her childhood and show her classmates who she had become. What kind of man had chosen her? "You bastards, this is for you," flashed through her mind. "I'm a decent woman, so I want a decent man." "I give you time to think," came Mr. Jason's voice to her. "And I can answer at once," seriously she said. "I do. I want a normal family. I want to have children." "We'll have children. I promise you," he pressed her hand in his. Anne had never had an evening like this in her life. She stood by her car, afraid to let Jason go. He didn't want to leave her either. The goodbye kiss came to an end. They hugged once more, and she got into the car. "I'll see you tomorrow," he waved. "Good night to you." The woman looked at him intently, but Anne's night was not going to be a very restful one. So far, she knew nothing about it. Driving home, it seemed to her that her car did not touch the ground. "Here it is, my long-awaited happiness," she said aloud. "We had worked side by side for so many years, and only now we realized that it was fate." She saw the light from the corridor and realized that Michael was home. "Michael's doctor arrived today. He's taken a turn for the worse. Because of your scandal, he could die? Please help my son," Mrs. Caroline exclaimed. "I can't." Anne shrugged her shoulders. "I'm getting married." What her mother-in-law was surprised. "What do you mean you're getting married? What about Michael? He'll die without you." "But I'm not to blame for his illness," she glanced at her husband. "If you've come to get your things, I'll wait." "You can't do that," Michael's mother said sternly. "Or did you have a lover?" Her eyes narrowed and she looked like a fox. "Was that the reason?" No, Anne didn't want to continue the conversation. "I just met my man the other day, so there was no question of cheating." Her mother-in-law's little eyes darted back and forth. She couldn't figure out what she needed to do to get things back to normal. Anne, her voice softened. "But you realize Michael loves you. To know a man for a couple of days and leave a husband like that?" She shook her head. "I can assure you it's such a relief," Anne grinned. "Take it easy. Michael couldn't take it anymore. I've worked so hard to make sure you have everything." She laughed. "Are you saying I've been living off you all this time? You have no conscience at all? How much effort I put into my cafe, and all for you." "You mean the pie shop that I gave you over $1 million for?" Anne had no more patience for these insolents. "That's it. I've had enough. Get out. Get out of my flat." She pointed at the door. "I just hate you, you sneaky bastards who've been sitting on my neck all this time. Get out. You're going to regret this. Are you going to come crawling back to Michael on your knees?" My mother-in-law threatened to say goodbye. "Who cares about you, you little bogeyman? My son is a fool for paying attention to you. Ruined his life." She didn't even think it was possible to do such a cruel thing. It's all coming to a head. Anne closed the door behind her guests and sat down on the sofa. God, and how could I have been so blind? They were just using me, she sobbed. Anne was going to leave something to her husband after the divorce. His car she definitely wanted to give him. But after what he and his mum had done, she went on principle. The car had been bought with her money, and she could easily prove it. Michael wasn't working at the time, so the truth was on her side. No matter how hard Mrs. Caroline tried, no matter what lawyers she sent to her, they couldn't do anything. Anne, come on, screamed the guests at the wedding. Mr. Jason kept up with her. This time Anne was having all the fun she could. Miss Anne and her husband were always participating in contests. After signing in, they sat down at the table. Mr. Jason held his wife close to him. She kissed him. My happiness. He kept his eyes on her. Anne, darling. Tears came out of his eyes. And then they went on their honeymoon. The newlyweds didn't want to advertise or surprise anyone. They just went on a tour of Europe. God, this stuff is delicious. Anne closed her eyes in pleasure when she tasted real Viennese waffles. She greedily absorbed everything around her. She hadn't realized she was enjoying the story so much. Jason, look at this, she pointed at the medieval temple. They were standing in a square that was surrounded by stunning buildings. The honeymoon had strengthened the couple even more. They chatted for hours on end. Anne had never experienced, even in her dreams, that it was possible to live like this. Mr. Jason was a grown man, so he didn't give Anne a hard time when someone looked at her or wanted to meet her. Where did this one come from? You're not an ice cream. I can't leave you alone for a minute, he grinned. From Namibia. He complimented me on my beauty, he laughed. Sometimes I wish you'd taken off your glasses when you were wearing them. You didn't get hit on so often by suitors, he supported her laughter. And a year after that journey, Anne had a daughter, a tiny baby Elvira. I've always wanted my daughter to be called Elvira, her father shook her contentedly. I think with such a name she will be a real schoolgirl. I can't wait to chase her. You'll complain later. I'd rather she was in the pram asleep. Anne laughed. Look at her, she's already restless. Elvira changed her voice and waved her arms. Well, Fidgety, come here. Anne took her daughter in her arms and pressed her to her chest. No one had ever thought it was possible to play with one's life like this.